the light that shouldn't exist. It began with a glow small at first, no brighter than a distant star, but too steady, too controlled. From the outer edge of the solar system, something moved, carrying light that refused to behave as light should. Astronomers first noticed it as a faint anomaly on wide-field sky surveys, a single point of illumination that did not flicker, did not fade, and did not fit into any known celestial pattern. They labeled it provisionally 3I divided by Atlas, an interstellar object, another visitor from beyond. But even before the official designation, those who had seen the first readings whispered that this was no comet. Comets burned with chaos tails unraveling, gas jets bursting from fractured ice. This light was too perfect, too calm. Across observatories from Hawaii to Chile, long exposure images revealed something uncanny. Where ordinary comets blurred into motion, Atlas remained sharp, centered, unwavering against the starfield. Its coma, instead of the usual wispy, uneven haze, formed a flawless sphere of pale blue radiance. It pulsed faintly once every few minutes as though breathing in the vacuum. No one could explain that rhythm. When the first spectroscopy data arrived, the unease deepened. The expected molecular fingerprints, water, carbon dioxide, ammonia, were nearly absent. Instead, the instruments captured a broad, featureless emission, a perfect plateau across the visible and infrared bands. It was the kind of light produced not by reflection or chemistry, but by something generating energy internally. The astronomers convened quietly. In dimly lit control rooms, faces glowed with monitor light as numbers scrolled past, defying every model. The younger researchers were thrilled, eager to publish. The older ones stared in silence, understanding too well that this kind of discovery did not belong entirely to science. One whispered, "It's not supposed to be that bright." Another replied, "It's not supposed to be at all." They recalibrated instruments, checked for lens flares, for cosmic ray contamination, for anything that could reduce the impossible to the explainable. Nothing changed. Atlas's light persisted steady, unwavering, maddeningly precise. When the object moved inward, its brightness should have followed a known curve, brightening with proximity, then fading predictably as solar radiation ablated its surface. But Atlas defied that curve. Its luminosity increased exponentially, as though amplifying the sunlight it received. No outgassing, no jets, no fragmentation, just radiance, a cold mathematical consistency that unnerved even the most rational minds. "It's like it wants to be seen," murmured a technician at the Palomar Observatory, his voice barely audible over the hum of machines. The others did not answer. They all felt it, that sense of intent behind the data, that quiet suggestion of awareness buried in the patterns of light. Within a week, the international astronomical community was abuzz. Publicly, the discovery was celebrated, an interstellar visitor, the third of its kind after Oumuamua and Borisov. Privately, messages crossed encrypted lines, urgent, nervous, full of restrained panic. The reports mentioned anomalous energy emissions, non-reflective spectral signatures, and, most disturbingly, consistent modulation. In plain terms, it meant that the light was changing in deliberate, repeating ways. A natural body could not do that, not without help. At first, the anomaly was dismissed as sensor interference, but when multiple observatories confirmed the same readings, each from different hemispheres, different instruments, different nights, the dismissal evaporated. By then, Atlas's light had grown strong enough to be visible through amateur telescopes. Social media filled with images, a radiant dot cutting through constellations, its color shifting between silver blue and pale green. Some claimed to see a halo around it, faint but symmetrical. Others swore that when they looked long enough, they could sense a strange vibration, a hum, as if the object were alive. The world watched, fascinated, unaware of what the scientists already feared. Behind the public announcements lay the quiet terror of professionals forced to confront the unthinkable. Energy cannot be created from nothing. Yet Atlas was glowing as though powered by an endless reservoir. It's feeding on something, a physicist at the European Southern Observatory wrote in a private note. But what could it possibly be drawing from, this far from any star? Had watches to Strom's lack. In the following days, telescopic arrays tuned to other wavelengths, radio, ultraviolet, even X-ray, found traces of emission far beyond what sunlight could account for. The object was releasing power across the spectrum, not reflecting it. If it were a comet, one analyst muttered, It would be disintegrating under that output. But it's not. It's stable. Too stable. Word reached certain offices far from observatories, places where discoveries of this magnitude triggered protocols, not celebrations. Space surveillance networks reoriented satellites toward the new arrival. Deep space listening posts began scanning frequencies near its path. Somewhere in a secure basement beneath Washington, a man in a tailored suit read a report and said quietly, "Flag it under active observation." Another, standing in the shadow behind him, whispered, "Do we notify the public?" The first man closed the file. Not yet. In the nights that followed, as Atlas crept closer, the unease spread. Astronomers began to notice that its trajectory, though mathematically perfect, carried subtle deviations. Minuscule, but there. Tiny changes in velocity, too consistent to be random. Adjustments, corrections, like a pilot making sure a craft stayed on course. They recorded the data but hesitated to share it. Those who did found their reports edited, their access temporarily suspended for system review. Within scientific circles, a phrase began circulating in whispers: controlled motion. Meanwhile, the public fascination grew. News anchors called it the cosmic visitor of the decade. Documentaries rushed into production, but while the world looked up with wonder, a smaller group looked up with dread. They had begun to suspect that this light, this calm, perfect light, was not just a phenomenon to study, but a signal to interpret. For every night it grew brighter, more defined, more deliberate, and deep down, even the most skeptical scientists began to feel that the light of 3I divided by Atlas was not a reflection of the sun at all. It was a reflection of something else entirely, something watching back. Eyes of the observers. The first to truly grasp the scale of the anomaly were not the scientists in the news, but the quiet watchers, the men and women who lived beneath the glow of monitors deep inside observatories and defense installations. They were used to staring into nothing, to living their lives in silence, their eyes locked on the shifting dots of the universe. But Atlas changed that silence. Its light, even when reduced to numbers and waveforms, seemed to carry something alive within it. In Hawaii, at the Mauna Kea Observatory, a senior astrophysicist named Dr. Lena Moreau leaned over her console, her reflection merging with the faint image of Atlas's halo. The glow didn't shimmer like normal reflected sunlight. It pulsed, measured, intentional. The first time she noticed the pattern, she thought it was an artifact, a processing glitch. But when she compared it with readings from the Chilean ALMA array, the pulse matched exactly. 5-minute intervals, she whispered to her assistant. Every 5 minutes, on the mark. Her assistant, a quiet man with trembling hands, only nodded. It's like it's keeping time. Half a world away, in the mountains of Spain, the Canary Island telescopes confirmed the same periodic flicker. It wasn't random, it wasn't mechanical noise, it was a rhythm. The light from Atlas had structure. When they mapped the oscillations onto a waveform, the curve was too symmetrical, too elegant. It wasn't chaos, it was design. Someone joked nervously, "Maybe it's sending Morse code." And the laughter that followed was forced, thin, frightened. By the second week of observation, international collaboration had become chaos. NASA, ESA, JAXA, and private observatories tried to coordinate, but behind the emails and teleconferences, there were divisions. Certain data sets vanished mid-transfer. Others came back redacted, marked proprietary or pending clearance. No one knew who was restricting access or why. Dr. Moreau's team discovered that the US Deep Space Network had started transmitting in the same frequency range used to track Atlas, but the response patterns they received were scrambled. She tried to request the transmission logs. Her request was denied. But leaks have a way of escaping gravity. Late one night, an anonymous file appeared on a closed astrophysics forum, a collection of graphs, timestamps, and infrared readings labeled Satellite Intercept 14, Energy Pattern Consistency Report. It showed something that chilled everyone who saw it: spectral spikes corresponding perfectly with known power transmission signatures. In simpler terms, Atlas wasn't just emitting light, it was emitting power. Controlled, coherent, and stable. "You could power a city with that," wrote one user. "Or signal across galaxies," another replied. The observers' fear grew with the data. The longer they watched, the clearer the realization became. Atlas was behaving less like an object in space and more like a device. Its brightness increased according to no solar logic. The radiation flares followed cycles that hinted at feedback like a machine regulating itself. When it entered the inner solar system, it began reflecting sunlight in a way that seemed intentional. Satellites noted tiny energy surges when it aligned directly with Earth, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to be noticed by those who knew what to look for. And then came the sounds. Radio telescopes in Australia detected faint, low-frequency modulations barely audible, buried in cosmic background noise. At first, they thought it was interference from Earth's own transmitters, but after cross-checking with arrays in Chile, South Africa, and Japan, the truth emerged. The noise was coming from Atlas itself. It wasn't a clean signal, no language, no obvious code, just a steady, thrumming resonance that oscillated through the void like the echo of an ancient drum beat. Some compared it to a heartbeat, others said it felt like the vibration of a distant engine. The chatter among astronomers turned desperate. Could this be a natural harmonic resonance from dust or plasma? Could it be radio wave reflection? Each theory fell apart under scrutiny. Every analysis pointed to one impossible conclusion. The frequency drift was deliberate, reactive. When a satellite adjusted its listening angle, the modulation changed, as if the source had noticed the attention. By then, secret agencies had already taken over. The watchers didn't just work in observatories anymore, they were pulled into secured rooms, made to sign silence agreements, and shown footage from deep space surveillance arrays. The footage showed Atlas not as a point of light, but as a shape, a rounded, reflective mass, surrounded by symmetrical flares of energy. It was not smooth like a rock, nor jagged like ice. It was too perfect, too engineered. "We're not looking at a comet," one officer said during the briefing. "We're looking at architecture." But not everyone was convinced. Dr. Moreau tried to resist the paranoia. She argued that the mind saw patterns in randomness, that fear distorted data. Yet each night, as the object drew closer, the evidence piled higher. Its movements were too clean, its emission too stable. It behaved like a craft executing maneuvers in gravitational fields. It wasn't falling into the sun's pull, it was navigating through it. Then came the anomaly that changed everything. On the 12th night, a series of telescopic images captured a faint trail extending from Atlas's coma, an almost invisible thread of luminous particles that seemed to shimmer and then retract. When the sequence was accelerated, it looked like an expulsion, a deliberate release of material followed by immediate reabsorption. Comets don't reclaim their tails, but Atlas did. Within 24 hours, the data vanished from public databases. Observatory access was restricted under temporary technical maintenance. Dr. Moreau received a message from her government contact. Cease observation until further notice. Data classified. She deleted the message but couldn't delete the dread. Whatever Atlas was, it had crossed a line between cosmic curiosity and strategic threat. And so the observers kept watching, even when they weren't supposed to. They used personal equipment, private feeds, even amateur telescopes, because they all sensed the same thing in their bones. Atlas was aware. It was watching them back. Every flicker of its light, every subtle change in brightness, felt less like coincidence and more like acknowledgement. A silent, distant nod from something that knew it was being studied. And as those eyes on Earth kept staring into the night, they could not escape one thought. In the vastness of the void, there was no such thing as coincidence. The silence, behind the announcements. By the time 3I divided by Atlas entered public awareness, its mystery had already been rewritten. News anchors smiled brightly beneath studio lights, their voices threaded with rehearsed enthusiasm as they announced a remarkable new interstellar comet discovered by the Atlas survey. The headlines were harmless, optimistic, designed to soothe curiosity without feeding fear. The official narrative was simple: a rare but natural wanderer from beyond the solar system, another chance to study the relics of ancient galaxies. What the public didn't know was that those headlines had been prepared before the data was fully analyzed. Inside the observatories, silence settled like dust. The researchers who had first sounded the alarm were suddenly withdrawn from interviews. Statements they had given to the press were retracted, clarified, or outright replaced. Requests for the full spectral data went unanswered. Websites displaying Atlas's light curve were taken offline for server maintenance. The deeper the public's fascination grew, the quieter the experts became. At the European Space Agency headquarters, the communications director read the official press release aloud, to a room of scientists and analysts. 3. I divided by Atlas is a dynamically new interstellar comet displaying atypical but natural behavior consistent with variable sublimation patterns. Around the table, no one spoke. They all knew that the statement was a lie. The brightness pattern was not variable. It was consistent, unnaturally so. But the truth had already been buried under phrasing, carefully designed to sound technical yet dismissive. Dr. Lena Moreau watched the press conference from her office in Paris, the flicker of the screen casting pale light across her face. The ESA's chief scientist smiled warmly for the cameras, promising transparency and collaboration. Behind him, the agency's insignia gleamed like a seal of authority. But to those who had seen the classified reports, his words carried an entirely different meaning. Collaboration meant control. Transparency meant silence. She opened her inbox again. Her credentials for remote telescope access had been suspended. No explanation, no apology. The message was signed by a department she had never heard of. Division of Deep Space Anomalies, Interim Oversight Committee. The email ended with a warning. Do not discuss ongoing analysis with unauthorized personnel. She stared at the signature line, feeling an invisible weight pressing down on her. It wasn't just about Atlas anymore. It was about containment. Around the same time, a small group of amateur astronomers noticed something strange. The orbital prediction models available on NASA's website began to diverge from their own independent calculations. The discrepancy was minor at first, fractions of a degree, but it grew. When they tried to ask why, the forums where they posted their findings were quietly removed. Accounts vanished overnight. A moderator simply wrote, "Misinformation policy enforcement. In a world of endless data, silence can feel louder than noise." The more institutions spoke of routine updates and operational security, the clearer the deception became. Even journalists began to sense it. A reporter from The Guardian requested interviews with several Atlas researchers, only to receive polite refusals or no reply at all. 2 days later, she received a call from a government liaison, reminding her that the subject was of limited scientific significance, and suggesting she focus instead on more public interest topics. She hung up without answering. Meanwhile, whispers grew among those with access to the raw telemetry. Something had shifted in the object's energy readings. The steady light had changed, subtly, as though its rhythm had adapted. When one research team attempted to publish an internal memo about potential modulated emissions, they were visited by agency representatives who confiscated their hard drives. The memo never resurfaced. In the United States, a closed-door meeting took place at the Goddard Space Flight Center. A dozen officials from various departments, NASA, the Department of Defense, the NSA, gathered around a table littered with reports and sealed folders. A senior advisor from the Pentagon spoke first. This object exhibits properties beyond standard cometary behavior. For the sake of global stability, communication on the subject will follow national security protocols. A NASA administrator protested, "This is a scientific discovery, not a threat." The advisor didn't raise his voice. Until proven otherwise, it's both. After that meeting, the language surrounding Atlas shifted globally. Press statements became sterile, stripped of wonder. Observations once shared publicly were now under review. Requests for telescope time were denied for technical conflicts. And yet, the object continued to shine visible to anyone with eyes, undeniable, luminous, constant. It was as though the world had collectively agreed to look but not see. The scientists who dared to speak privately began using coded language. In encrypted group chats, they referred to Atlas as the mirror. They joked, bitterly, that it was reflecting not sunlight but the truth about humanity's fear of the unknown. One message, later leaked anonymously, read, "They've turned an interstellar mystery into a classified threat. We're studying it like a weapon, not a wonder." But the silence was not absolute. Rumors always find cracks. A grainy screenshot began circulating online, allegedly from a classified report. It showed spectral graphs and the words non-terrestrial origin, unconfirmed containment advised. The post vanished within hours, but not before being mirrored across countless anonymous forums. People began asking dangerous questions. Why were governments hiding data about a comet? What were they afraid of? Late one night, Dr. Moreau received a call from an old colleague at the European Space Operations Center. His voice was trembling. "They've rerouted 2 surveillance satellites. Both are focused on Atlas now. They're not studying it, they're tracking it. She asked what that meant. He hesitated, then said softly, "They think it's moving with purpose." The line went dead. The next morning, the official ESA feed announced that no unusual behavior had been observed. By then, the silence had become its own kind of evidence. The press conferences grew rarer, the data releases shorter. Scientists who once celebrated the discovery of interstellar objects now avoided even mentioning the name. And while the public moved on to the next headline, those who watched the skies at night knew that something was deeply wrong. For every missing dataset, for every deleted file, Atlas's glow seemed to burn brighter, as if mocking the effort to bury its truth. It drifted across the heavens, quiet, patient, unyielding, its impossible light carving through layers of deception. And those few who still dared to whisper about it shared the same thought, unspoken yet unanimous. Whatever Atlas was, it did not come to be ignored. Reports in the shadows. The first classified briefings came wrapped in language so clinical it almost disguised the fear beneath. Internal memoranda between agencies referred to energy irregularities, trajectory deviations, and unidentified transmission intervals. None dared use the word intelligent, yet as more data arrived, that word began to press itself into the margins of every report like a ghost trying to manifest through ink. In early March, a handful of high-ranking analysts within the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency received what was called the Interstellar Object Situation Summary. The front page bore the insignias of multiple international partners, but the body of the text had been redacted to near uselessness. Still, one paragraph slipped through. Observed radiative persistence exceeds all modeled expectations. Emission stability suggests internal regulation mechanism or non-natural process. In the sterile jargon of intelligence, that was as close to panic as a sentence could get. The document, though never intended for public eyes, found its way to a contractor who had been running cross-spectral analysis for a subcontracted research lab. The man, known only by the alias Kite, copied the section onto an encrypted flash drive. 2 weeks later, portions of the file appeared on an anonymous message board frequented by amateur astronomers and conspiracy theorists. The thread's title was simple: "The object is powered." Within hours it was deleted, the user banned, the archive wiped. But copies of the text spread like spores, mirrored across the dark corners of the internet. For most people, it was another hoax in a long lineage of cosmic exaggerations. But to those who had been following the quiet silences, it was confirmation. Someone, somewhere, knew more about Atlas than they were admitting, and they were afraid. Meanwhile, the reports multiplied in private channels. Leaked summaries from European and Asian space agencies described something even more disturbing. Atlas appeared to be responding. When solar flares erupted from the sun's surface, its brightness would shift in synchronization, not delayed, but simultaneous, as though reacting in real time. Plasma ejections that should have overwhelmed its surface produced no change in trajectory, no visible stress. Instead, the object's glow stabilized, as if absorbing or countering the solar flux. "It's compensating," wrote one French scientist in a private memo. "It's not enduring the storm, it's adjusting to it." However, the simulators watching. That phrase, "it's adjusting," echoed across closed networks of intelligence and scientific circles. The implications were staggering. A natural body could not adjust. It could only react according to physics. And if Atlas was not reacting according to physics, then it was doing something else entirely, something purposeful. But official channels denied everything. When pressed for comment, NASA's Public Affairs Office released a statement calling the leaked reports fabrications of online speculation. They emphasized that all behavior observed remains consistent with known cometary physics. Yet within internal correspondence obtained later by journalists, one administrator had written bluntly, "If this is consistent with anything, it's with control, not chaos." The hidden networks of scientists, journalists, and whistleblowers grew more active. They began cross-referencing satellite telemetry with amateur observatory data, compiling independent logs in defiance of official restrictions. It was in these underground collaborations that the pattern became undeniable. Atlas was not simply maintaining a trajectory, it was managing it. Small adjustments, precisely timed, kept it perfectly balanced against gravitational shifts. The object was steering. The deeper they looked, the stranger it became. One analyst noticed faint microbursts of radiation preceding each course correction. They were not powerful enough to propel a massive object, but they were consistent, like signals coordinating a network of forces invisible to human instruments. The conclusion that began to form among the rogue observers was terrifying in its simplicity. Atlas wasn't moving by thrust, it was moving by interaction. It was bending the environment around it, subtly rewriting the gravitational field like an unseen hand smoothing fabric. And then the sightings began. High-altitude surveillance satellites ones the public wasn't supposed to know existed, captured frames of Atlas that didn't match its expected brightness pattern. The object appeared elongated, surrounded by concentric ripples of light. Some analysts said it looked like a field, an energy envelope pulsing outward. Others insisted it was merely a lensing effect, a trick of light through dust. But the longer they studied it, the more the shape shifted, almost breathing in rhythm with its own light. A low-level analyst described it in a note, later leaked online. Imagine a heart made of metal and light, beating in the dark. It helped now. The same week, rumors circulated through military channels that an automated probe had been dispatched to observe Atlas directly. No agency claimed responsibility, and no official acknowledgement was ever made. But a telemetry spike detected by independent trackers seemed to confirm it. An unregistered object had left Earth's orbit, moving in Atlas's direction. For 3 days, its signal was traceable. Then it vanished, no distress signal, no debris, no explanation. Swallowed, one anonymous official muttered in an intercepted chat, like it never existed. Within classified environments, the tone shifted from analysis to containment. A secret joint task group, codename Oracle, was assembled to coordinate observation under strict blackout. Their purpose was not to study Atlas, but to manage the fallout if its true nature ever became public. The group's internal motto, leaked months later, was chilling in its bluntness. Control the narrative, or the narrative controls us. One evening, Dr. Lena Moreau received an encrypted message from a colleague she hadn't heard from in weeks. The message contained no greeting, only a series of images, telemetry graphs, light curves, and at the bottom, a short line of text. "It's not alone." She stared at those words until the room seemed to tilt. The file included a secondary dataset, barely perceptible traces detected at the edge of the heliosphere. Faint, matching emissions following the same energy pattern as Atlas. The difference was distance. Whatever they were, there were more of them, too far to detect clearly, too synchronized to be coincidence. When she tried to verify the data, the connection cut. Her access was revoked permanently. A week later, a new press statement was issued worldwide. 3. I divided by Atlas continues its predictable path beyond Mars orbit. No anomalous behavior detected. The watchers knew better. They had seen the reports, read the leaks, witnessed the silencing. Atlas was not the first of its kind, merely the first that humanity had caught in time to see. The others were still coming. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the watchers realized with cold certainty, they weren't the only ones watching anymore. The pattern in the sky. For a while, it seemed as though the chaos would fade. Governments issued calm reassurances. Public fascination dimmed as the object, 3i divided by Atlas, receded from naked eye visibility. Most of the world moved on, distracted by the next headline, the next crisis. But the people who still watched the sky, astronomers, researchers, amateur stargazers, began to notice something that should have been impossible. Atlas was fading, yes, but not uniformly. Its light dimmed in precise intervals, rhythmic, as if following an unseen metronome. Those who charted its brightness found a pattern that defied randomness. Every 11.2 hours, its luminosity dropped sharply, then recovered. The repetition was unnerving, too clean, too constant. Someone joked online that Atlas had developed a heartbeat. The post was deleted within minutes, but screenshots persisted, and soon the term spread through underground forums. The comet's pulse. A small team of independent astronomers in South America decided to test whether the pulse was an observational illusion. They coordinated telescope data across 3 continents, timing exposures down to fractions of a second. When they compared their results, the rhythm held perfectly. The timing didn't drift even after days of observation. No known physical process, sublimation, rotation, precession, could explain it. Something was controlling the light. At first, the scientists speculated that the pattern might be a form of tumbling or rotation, perhaps a reflective surface periodically catching sunlight. But when they modeled this scenario, the math broke apart. The reflections would have produced variations in both brightness and color. Atlas's light, however, remained spectrally stable, its hue unchanged across every interval. It was as if the object was deliberately modulating its brightness, without altering its material composition, a technical feat beyond comprehension for a body the size of a mountain. Leaked correspondence from a European research facility later revealed that the pulse was being tracked in multiple wavelengths, including radio and infrared. The frequencies aligned across spectra, forming what appeared to be a synchronized emission cycle. That was when one researcher made an unsettling discovery. When plotted on a time-frequency graph, the emission pattern didn't just look mechanical, it looked encoded. The intervals matched the ratios used in prime number sequences. When the finding reached intelligence analysts, they didn't laugh. Instead, they classified it. Within hours, the servers holding the observational data were seized. The lead researcher was reassigned to an unrelated aerospace project. Officially, the prime number correlation was dismissed as an artifact of statistical overfitting. But in private, the analysts debated a question that none dared to write down. Was Atlas transmitting a message? Meanwhile, the global network of amateur observers, the ones unshackled by security protocols, kept studying. Their decentralized nature made them impossible to fully silence. They began publishing anonymous logs, using mirror servers and encrypted networks. Over time, a chilling hypothesis took shape among them. The pattern in Atlas's light wasn't random, wasn't rotational, wasn't even communication in the conventional sense. It was mapping. One observer proposed that the brightness intervals corresponded to distances coordinates, possibly marking regions of interstellar space. When the intervals were translated into frequency ratios and plotted across galactic coordinates, the points aligned roughly with the positions of nearby star systems. The realization hit like a pulse of its own. Atlas wasn't just signaling, it was pointing. No official institution acknowledged the theory, but fragments of confirmation leaked. A suppressed white paper from a private aerospace firm contracted by the US government mentioned correlative alignment between Atlas emission intervals and exoplanetary system positions within 25 parsecs. The paper never reached publication. Within a day of its internal circulation, all copies were deleted from the company's archive. The author resigned weeks later, and still, the pattern persisted. Every 11.2 hours, a pulse. Every cycle, perfect. Some saw it as proof of machinery, others as evidence of consciousness. Conspiracy channels called it the beacon code, claiming that the object was transmitting instructions or warnings to unseen recipients. The mainstream media, when pressed, called these ideas cosmic pareidolia, the human tendency to see meaning in noise. But as the data grew stronger, the noise sounded more and more like intent. Then came the night of the three echoes. Is, 9, is, 9, is. Across 3 continents, Chile, Australia, and South Africa, radio telescopes detected a simultaneous triple spike in emission, precisely aligned with the 11.2-hour cycle. The frequencies were narrow, almost laser-like, and when analyzed, they carried harmonic overtones too complex for natural plasma bursts. The emissions were faint, but they originated from Atlas's location with mathematical precision. For 30 seconds, it was as if the object had spoken 3 times in 3 tones. Then it fell silent again. The effect on the research community was electric. Some believed it was confirmation of intelligent origin. Others called it coincidence, amplified by paranoia. But for those who had already seen the classified data, the pulse, the energy regulation, the impossible stability, this was the moment the question stopped being what Atlas was and became who it was meant for. Because buried within the data of the 3 echoes was a secondary anomaly. The first 2 frequencies pointed outward into deep interstellar space, but the third, it was directed back toward Earth. Governments scrambled to intercept and decode the emission. Supercomputers passed through billions of potential translations, searching for meaning. Linguists analyzed waveforms as though they were ancient scripts. Cryptographers tested for cipher patterns. Every attempt failed. But in the midst of the chaos, one independent researcher noticed something that others had missed. When the signal was inverted and mapped against the timing of Earth's own deep space broadcasts, the Voyager messages, the Arecibo signal, the constant hum of terrestrial radio, it mirrored them perfectly, like a reflection. The conclusion was too terrible to speak aloud. Atlas wasn't sending a message to Earth. It was sending a message about Earth. Whatever the pattern meant, it was gone as quickly as it came. The pulses returned to normal, steady as before, as though nothing had happened. The official line remained unchanged. No anomalous emissions detected. But among those who had seen the data, silence replaced skepticism. Because once you saw the pattern in the sky, you couldn't unsee it. And if you watched closely enough, it almost felt as though the light of Atlas was watching back. The energy signature. It began as a whisper in the data, tiny fluctuations in readings that should have been stable, meaningless, lost in cosmic background noise. But the analysts who worked the night shifts at the Mauna Kea Observatory had learned to recognize anomalies hiding in the noise. Atlas's energy output wasn't just strange anymore, it was impossible. Every comet radiates energy through sublimation, the release of volatile gases as sunlight heats its icy surface. It's a messy process, chaotic, inefficient, and always temporary. But 3I divided by Atlas behaved as if it had rewritten those laws. Its energy emission was steady, precise, and self-regulated, like a machine maintaining constant power output. And more disturbingly, it did so while losing almost no mass. When scientists recalculated its luminosity using deep infrared readings, they realized something that sent shockwaves through the community. Atlas was emitting more energy than it absorbed from the Sunday. The numbers didn't lie. Its radiation output exceeded its intake by nearly 12%. In the language of physics, that should have been impossible. Nothing in nature sustains energy without consumption, unless the source wasn't natural. At first, the data teams assumed it was an instrumentation error, a calibration drift, an atmospheric distortion, a fault in the processing pipeline. But after dozens of independent verifications across 3 observatories and 2 space-based telescopes, the results held. "The object is radiating," wrote one researcher in a confidential report, "as if powered from within." That report never saw the light of day. Within 48 hours, the entire project was classified under a defense directive and reassigned to the jurisdiction of the European Space Security Council. Access was revoked for all civilian researchers. A new official explanation was issued. Residual reflection anomalies caused by volatile ejection. But no one who had seen the numbers believed it. In the classified channels, a different language emerged. Scientists started referring to the object's internal power as the core. The term wasn't official, but it captured the eerie sense of deliberate containment. Whatever was generating the energy wasn't dispersing it randomly. It was controlled, focused, almost contained behind an invisible surface. One astronomer compared it to a reactor buried inside glass. An American physicist named Dr. Raymond Holst, one of the few civilians still with partial data access, broke protocol to share fragments of his analysis with an old colleague. His conclusion was bold to the point of heresy. The energy pattern fits no known natural isotope decay or fusion process. It's closer to a self-sustaining field interaction, something like a controlled zero-point system. In simple terms, he believed Atlas was tapping into the vacuum energy of space itself, the infinitesimal power woven into the quantum fabric of reality. If he was right, Atlas wasn't just mysterious, it was revolutionary. A functioning quantum vacuum reactor would represent an energy source infinite by human standards. Entire civilizations could live off such a system. But if that was true, another question loomed like a storm on the horizon. Who built it? Holst's email was intercepted. Within days, his credentials were revoked. His home office was raided under the guise of an intellectual property investigation. He disappeared from public life shortly after. His colleagues said he'd taken a sabbatical. Others whispered he'd been silenced. Meanwhile, the few scientists who still had clearance began to notice an even stranger phenomenon. The steady output from Atlas occasionally spiked, not randomly, but in synchronization with Earth's own electromagnetic field variations. Each time the planet experienced a geomagnetic storm, solar flare, or major energy event, Atlas's emissions surged as if responding to it, or worse, feeding off it. The correlation couldn't be coincidence. "It's as if it's listening," wrote one internal memo, "or drawing strength." He's saved to get a reserve. Independent analysts who reconstructed fragments of this data noticed something else buried in the readings, a faint modulation within the energy field, a repeating waveform. When isolated and transformed into audible frequencies, it produced an unsettling sound, a low, oscillating hum that rose and fell in steady rhythm. It wasn't random noise. It had structure, cadence, even pitch. One night, an audio engineer who had access to a leaked version of the recording overlaid the Atlas hum against radio telescope data from the 3 Echoes incident weeks earlier. The frequencies matched almost perfectly. The object wasn't just emitting light, it was radiating information. That was when the theories fractured. Some insisted the energy signature was artificial, the residue of propulsion or communication. Others argued it might be a form of life energy, like metabolism on a cosmic scale. The idea sounded insane until someone remembered a 1979 Soviet file leaked during the collapse of the USSR. It described an unexplained radiative organism observed near the orbit of Neptune, a glowing mass that seemed to breathe light. The file was dismissed as Cold War pseudoscience, until now. Governments, meanwhile, doubled down on secrecy. They issued denials wrapped in scientific jargon, claiming Atlas's energy readings were consistent with solar reflection artifacts. But behind those words, quiet panic grew. Defense planners held midnight briefings, where they discussed worst-case scenarios. What if Atlas's energy source could be weaponized? What if it could manipulate fields on a planetary scale? A British intelligence report, later leaked, revealed one particularly haunting calculation. If the energy output detected from Atlas was scaled to Earth's atmosphere, it would be enough to ignite a plasma field capable of disabling every satellite orbiting the planet in seconds. It was pure speculation, but the numbers didn't comfort anyone. Even as the world's leaders publicly reassured their citizens, their satellites continued to monitor the object obsessively. They watched every spike, every fluctuation, every pulse of light, like doctors monitoring a patient whose heartbeat defied reason. And through it all, Atlas remained eerily constant, its glow unwavering, its trajectory precise, its power undiminished. It drifted in the black silence between planets like a furnace disguised as a snowflake, whispering in wavelengths humanity barely understood. Dr. Moreau, now cut off from official communication, sat alone in her apartment, reviewing the scraps of data she had saved before her access was terminated. On her screen, the spectral graph glowed with faint traces of repeating harmonics. She zoomed in, following the rhythm of the light. It was steady, deliberate, measured like a signal or a heartbeat. And then she saw it. A gap in the pattern, a momentary dip followed by a sharp resurgence of output, perfectly timed to the energy peak recorded on Earth during the last geomagnetic storm. It was small but unmistakable. Atlas wasn't merely reacting to the universe, it was in sync with it. Something about that realization made her pulse quicken, because synchronization implied awareness, and awareness implied intent. She leaned closer to the screen, whispering to no one but herself, "It knows." There is no income. Outside, above the dark ocean, the comet still burned a steady, impossible flame against the void. The shift in trajectory. At first, it was a rounding error, just a fraction of a degree so small that any astronomer could have dismissed it as instrumental drift. But by the time the data was triple-checked, the truth was impossible to deny. 3I divided by Atlas had changed course. The shift was subtle, measured only in arc-seconds, but it defied the clean logic of celestial mechanics. No comet or asteroid could alter its own trajectory without external force. Even gas jets, the usual culprit for minor deviations, could not explain the precision or smoothness of the movement. The object hadn't been nudged, it had steered. The first observatory to notice was in Chile, its instruments tracing the faint line of the comet's projected path against the background of distant stars. When the predicted position failed to match the reality, the director called for an immediate recalibration. But when every telescope, from Hawaii to Madrid, confirmed the same deviation, an uneasy silence spread through the network. The shift grew measurable over the following weeks. Atlas was moving not randomly, but with intent, its new course skimming just inside the outer edge of the asteroid belt. The pattern was too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. "It's avoiding collisions," whispered one astronomer in disbelief. "It's navigating." Within hours, the private communication channels between major space agencies lit up with encrypted chatter. There were no official statements, only data transfers, silence wrapped in urgency. The European Space Agency flagged the anomaly as of strategic concern. The U.S. Space Command labeled it a potentially controlled body. That phrase, so carefully worded, was an admission they would never make publicly. By the end of the month, military satellites were reassigned, from orbital defense to constant monitoring of the object. Its every motion, every pulse, was recorded and cross-referenced against deep space radar. The readings confirmed what no one wanted to say aloud. Atlas's trajectory had shifted not once, but multiple times, each adjustment minute yet calculated. No natural explanation held up. If it were gas jets, the acceleration would be irregular. If it were gravitational perturbation, the direction would vary. Instead, each correction aligned perfectly with the positions of major celestial bodies, as though the object was plotting its own route through a crowded solar highway. The first leaked report described it bluntly. Trajectory adjustments are consistent with controlled navigation. Recommend immediate containment of information. Containment failed. An independent astronomer in Italy, unaware of the classification orders, published her findings on a public preprint server. Within hours, her paper titled Non-Gravitational Acceleration in 3I divided by Atlas was downloaded over 40,000 times. Before the day ended, it was gone, scrubbed from every database. But the data had already spread, mirrored on hundreds of encrypted forums and scientific archives. That was when the internet erupted. Conspiracy theorists declared Atlas an alien craft. Skeptics called it another case of misinterpretation. But for the quiet professionals in government offices, the panic online was nothing compared to the fear behind closed doors. Because the numbers were irrefutable. Atlas had intentionally altered its path around Jupiter, a maneuver requiring awareness of gravitational dynamics on a level humanity had only achieved with supercomputers. For those who understood orbital mechanics, the implication was staggering. If Atlas could correct its own trajectory with such precision, it wasn't just a wandering relic, it was a traveler with purpose. Then came the second deviation. It happened during a routine monitoring cycle. Observatories recorded another change, this time sharper, cleaner, almost elegant. Instead of drifting past the asteroid belt, Atlas adjusted its vector by a fraction of a degree, enough to align perfectly with Earth's orbital plane. The timing was mathematically perfect. When the news reached command centers, the air grew heavy. "Is it coming here?" someone asked in the Pentagon's underground situation room. The response was cautious but cold. "It's not colliding, it's aligning." That distinction should have comforted them. It didn't. Across the Atlantic, in a sealed chamber beneath Geneva, scientists of the European Space Council debated through the night. The trajectory could not be coincidence. The alignment placed Atlas in a near-resonant orbit synchronized with Earth for a period of roughly 27 days. The number chilled those who knew the classified data. 27 days was the same cycle as the pulse frequency, the same period embedded in the object's light and energy variations. The comet, the signal, and the orbit were now in perfect harmony. Dr. Lena Moreau, who had been following the restricted feeds through her last surviving access link, stared at the figures until her vision blurred. The pattern was undeniable. Atlas was positioning itself not to strike, but to watch. Its orbital plane would keep it in ideal observational alignment with Earth for weeks, long enough to map, to scan, to study. And then, something stranger happened. During its closest approach, satellite radar recorded faint bursts of ionization, tiny electromagnetic waves rippling through the solar wind around Atlas. They radiated outward, curved, and converged toward Earth's magnetic field. The shape of the pattern looked eerily deliberate. Some called it a ripple signature, others called it a handshake. As soon as the data was verified, networks went dark. Several observatories reported simultaneous power failures. The internal logs, however, told a different story. The power wasn't lost, it was redirected. Instruments had briefly drawn more current than their circuits could produce, as if something had interfered with their systems and drained energy outward. In the following hours, military radar picked up a faint echo, an invisible disturbance propagating from Atlas's direction toward the outer layers of Earth's ionosphere. It wasn't a physical object, but a wave, invisible and structured. The official explanation, when it finally came, was predictable. The anomalies were blamed on solar activity. Solar winds interacting with geomagnetic fields, the press release read. But anyone who had seen the classified graphs knew the truth. The pulses matched the Atlas cycle perfectly. The object wasn't only steering, it was communicating again. In a secure lab beneath Colorado, a defense scientist examined the filtered waveform. Its peaks and valleys were too precise, too intentional. When converted into binary, The first sequence spelled out a recognizable mathematical structure. The Fibonacci series, nature's own code. A message written not in language, but in universal order. Dr. Moreau's hands trembled as she stared at the decoded data shared through an anonymous link. It wasn't random, and it wasn't meaningless. The Fibonacci series was the signature of growth, structure, and life. Atlas wasn't just shifting trajectory, it was revealing design. And somewhere in the cold black between the stars, that design was now looking back at Earth, as if waiting to see what humanity would do next. The intercept began as a whisper between two satellites, an exchange of invisible data packets that should never have existed. It was late at night in a secure command center beneath Colorado Springs when the anomaly appeared. A communication relay satellite, designated DS-17, picked up a narrowband transmission from deep space. The signal was weak, its frequency buried within cosmic background noise. But when technicians isolated it, one detail sent shivers down the control room. The origin point matched the coordinates of 3I divided by Atlas. At first, the technicians thought it was interference, perhaps a harmonic bleed from a nearby communication array. But as they traced the signal's path, it became clear this was not an echo. The transmission was deliberate, encoded, and perfectly timed with Atlas's latest trajectory adjustment. Within minutes, the feed was rerouted to the Deep Space Network's central data node. The pattern repeated every 11 hours and 12 minutes, mirroring the comet's pulse. The modulation carried layers like harmonics in a musical chord, too structured to be random static. Every pulse was paired with a faint electromagnetic echo that bounced across several frequencies before fading into silence. That silence frightened the analysts more than the signal itself. For decades, deep space listening stations had intercepted countless bursts, solar flares, radio pulsars, even alien-sounding fast radio bursts that turned out to be human microwaves. But this was different. This signal carried intelligence in its rhythm, intent folded into energy. It didn't take long before military intelligence assumed control. Within an hour, every civilian scientist monitoring Atlas was locked out of real-time data. The intercept was classified under a code name that never appeared in public records: Project Helios. Inside the newly assembled task force, a handful of cryptologists, astrophysicists, and linguists worked in silence, surrounded by armed guards. Among them was Dr. Raymond Holst, quietly reinstated under a new identity. His previous warnings about the object's energy source were now considered too valuable to ignore. For weeks, they studied the intercepted waveforms. The data contained no obvious language, no repeating alphabet, no structure resembling human syntax. But when Holst analyzed the intervals between pulses, he noticed something extraordinary. The sequence matched the spacing of Earth's own deep space communication, attempts the Arecibo message of 1974, the Voyager Golden Record, and several lesser-known test transmissions from the early 2000s. It was as if Atlas was responding to Earth's long-forgotten attempts at contact. When Holst presented his findings, the room fell silent. "It's not speaking to us," he said slowly. "It's acknowledging that we've spoken." A murmur rippled through the task force. Some of the analysts leaned closer to their screens, replaying the audio-transformed signal. The hum was deep, resonant, almost melodic. When amplified, it carried a faint oscillation like a heartbeat mixed with the whisper of static wind. One engineer converted the frequency into sound and played it through the command center speakers. The result was a low, undulating tone that seemed to vibrate inside the bones, a sound so haunting that one guard stepped back instinctively. Holst listened with his eyes closed. "It's not just a reply," he whispered. "It's a recognition pattern, like a system handshake." The idea spread quickly. If Atlas's transmission was a handshake, it meant the object had not only detected human broadcasts, it had analyzed and matched them. It was performing an exchange, verifying that it understood who was listening. A week later, the pattern changed. At exactly 3:14 UTC, the signal split into two distinct streams, one directed outward into deep space, and another angled directly toward Earth's orbit. The first seemed to fade toward the distant constellation Lyra, while the second grew stronger, more focused. That was when global defense satellites began to pick up strange reflections, microscopic distortions in the ionosphere. To the untrained eye, they were meaningless flickers, but when cross-referenced with the intercept data, the reflections mirrored the structure of the Atlas signal exactly, as if Earth's own atmosphere was being used as part of a communication relay. Someone or something was using the planet itself as a receiver. The official reports buried the discovery under layers of scientific jargon. Ionospheric perturbations consistent with electromagnetic resonance, one document read. But the private notes circulating among the scientists were more direct. Atlas has linked to Earth's magnetic field. Governments panicked in silence. Emergency meetings convened under the guise of space weather monitoring. Defense networks debated whether the signal constituted a threat. Could Atlas manipulate satellites? Could it hijack communication systems? Could it listen? Within days, several satellite constellations reported temporary loss of signal synchronization. GPS systems faltered briefly, clock cycles drifted, and encrypted communication links desynced by milliseconds. The anomalies were dismissed as routine software malfunctions, but the classified logs told a darker story. The drift coincided exactly with Atlas's transmission bursts. Project Helios redoubled its efforts. A parallel team at MIT was covertly enlisted to analyze the intercepted waveform, using machine learning to detect potential structure. After several failed attempts, the algorithm produced a model suggesting the signal contained nested layers encoded data within data, like Russian dolls of information. When visualized in 3D, the inner structure resembled a lattice, spiraling like a DNA helix. It wasn't language in the human sense, but it carried mathematical symmetry far too elegant to be accidental. The realization hit everyone in the room at once. The signal wasn't a message, it was a blueprint. The implications were terrifying. If the lattice was an encoded design, what did it represent? A map? A formula? A construct? One analyst joked nervously that it looked like a machine seed, something meant to replicate. No one laughed. As the days passed, something else began to happen. The intervals between transmissions shortened, the pulses quickened, gaining rhythm, forming clusters of data bursts that seemed to synchronize with each passing rotation of Earth. The object, far beyond the Moon's orbit, appeared to be adapting, reacting to Earth's movements as if tracking them. That night, Dr. Holst stared at the latest data stream, heart pounding. When the new transmission was decoded into a spectrum map, the peaks formed a geometric pattern. It wasn't random, it wasn't abstract, it was the shape of Earth. A faint, glowing outline latitude and longitude represented in frequency and amplitude rendered perfectly in the spectrum. Atlas wasn't just observing, it was scanning. When Holst reported the discovery, the director of Project Helios simply nodded, expression unreadable. "Then it's already begun," he said quietly. "Begun what?" Holst asked. The director looked at the screen, the pale blue frequency map pulsing like a heartbeat. Contact. Initentary souls. And somewhere in the vast silence between planets, Atlas shimmered, releasing another pulse, a wave of light so faint that only machines could feel it, but so deliberate it seemed almost human. The intercept had been completed, and whatever Atlas had been waiting for it had found it. The global shutdown. It began quietly, as such things always do, too quiet, too unassuming to betray the storm that would follow. At precisely 2:03 UTC, global communication satellites began to flicker. The first alerts came from the telemetry divisions in Alaska, then from tracking stations in Madrid, Canberra, and Tokyo. Each system reported a simultaneous synchronization drift, a polite technical term for something that should have been impossible. Every satellite clock on Earth had desynced by exactly the same fraction of a second. At first, engineers assumed it was a software glitch. Some joked it was the Y2K of the stars. But within an hour, it was no longer a joke. The errors cascaded outward through network layers, military systems, aviation radars, banking timestamps, global positioning frameworks, all thrown into quiet chaos by a single point of failure no one could identify. By sunrise, aircraft navigational systems over the Atlantic began reporting temporal anomalies, differences between GPS and inertial readings, off by mere milliseconds but enough to throw flight paths off course by kilometers. Air traffic controllers scrambled to correct routes manually. Satellites resynced themselves automatically, but the drift returned minutes later, as if the problem were being maintained rather than fixed. When data analysts began cross-referencing the timing of each desynchronization event, they discovered something chilling. The pulses coincided perfectly with Atlas's electromagnetic bursts. Every spike in its emission correlated with a global momentary blackout, as if the object were casting an invisible net of influence across Earth's electromagnetic systems. The official response was immediate and desperate. The International Telecommunications Union declared a temporary orbital anomaly. The US and China simultaneously initiated emergency network lockdowns. Civilian observatories were ordered to halt their monitoring programs. In the background, governments began to prepare for something they couldn't name. Behind sealed doors, intelligence officials gathered in soundproof chambers deep beneath the Earth. Geneva, Washington, Moscow, Beijing. Project Helios was no longer a research initiative. It had been absorbed into a global emergency directive known as the Silence Protocol. The goal was simple: contain panic. The means to do so were anything but. The Silence Protocol authorized immediate suppression of any public data connected to Atlas. Observatory networks were cut from the internet. University researchers were gagged by legal orders. Cloud servers were purged. Those who asked too many questions received polite visits from people who never introduced themselves by name. But the silence couldn't hold. The world had grown too connected, too fast. Within hours, screenshots of corrupted satellite feeds began appearing on encrypted forums. Amateur astronomers uploaded spectral analysis showing Atlas's growing energy emissions. Conspiracy channels flooded with frantic live streams showing flickering skies where GPS constellations should have been visible. In one viral clip, an operator at a civilian observatory in Norway pointed her camera toward the faint glow of Atlas and whispered, "It's getting brighter." Her feed froze seconds later. When it came back online, the signal was gone, her channel deleted. Then, without warning, the first major power grid collapsed. It happened in North America, just as Atlas crossed the orbital plane of Mars. At 7:21 UTC, entire regions of the Midwest went dark, cities flickering like dying embers. Power stations shut down in chain reaction, one after another, not from overload but from absence. It was as if energy itself had been drained. At the same moment, in space, a U.S. surveillance satellite went offline. Its last transmission showed something strange, a faint wave of ionization sweeping across its sensors, like a veil of static lightning. When engineers attempted to reboot the satellite, they discovered that its onboard atomic clock had reset, not to zero, but to an unfamiliar timestamp: 3 hours, 14 minutes, and 15 seconds. The numbers were the same ones found in Atlas's intercepted transmissions. Panic began to spread, though not publicly. The world above still ran, oblivious to the threads unraveling beneath its surface. Television stations continued to broadcast, internet traffic resumed, but in the control rooms of power grids and orbital command centers, a realization was dawning. Humanity's technological foundation was being quietly rewritten. At CERN, particle accelerators registered anomalous magnetic interference, the same frequency embedded in Atlas's pulse. Researchers noticed small oscillations in their containment fields, vibrations that matched the rhythm of the object's emissions. It was as if the comet's invisible field had reached Earth not physically, but through resonance. Then, one by one, the world's observatories began to report identical phenomena: faint, circular distortions in the night sky, like ripples spreading across invisible water. They weren't optical illusions, they were gravitational disturbances, tiny, measurable warps in space-time itself, synchronized with the Atlas cycle. Governments went dark. Public news agencies suddenly filled the airwaves with distractions, market reports, celebrity scandals, sports recaps. Nowhere was the word Atlas spoken, but the quiet panic among scientists deepened into dread. In underground bunkers, the task force debated a desperate question. Should they attempt to respond? If Atlas was transmitting, if it was synchronizing, perhaps it could also listen. The idea of sending a reply split the room. One faction argued that to remain silent would appear primitive, unworthy. The other warned that communication might trigger escalation. If Atlas was observing, what would happen when humanity declared itself seen? The debate ended when a simple truth became clear. The object was already listening. During the next global blackout, a faint signal was detected originating from Earth's own upper atmosphere. The frequency matched not the outgoing transmissions of Atlas, but their reflections, echoes of the same waveform bouncing back toward the comet. The planet itself was now transmitting, acting as an amplifier in a conversation humanity no longer controlled. For 3 consecutive nights, the sky pulsed faintly in synchronization with Atlas's light. Observers in remote regions described it as a heartbeat in the stars. The timing was too perfect to deny. Something unseen was linking the two. And then came the final act of the shutdown, a total communications silence. On a clear night over the Pacific, all long-range data satellites entered safe mode simultaneously. No signals went in, no signals came out. The entire digital architecture of civilization, GPS, global banking timestamps, even astronomical relays froze in unison. The stars themselves seemed to stand still. For 12 minutes, Earth went dark in the eyes of space. When systems rebooted, the global networks returned, but something had changed. Logs showed anomalies in the boot sectors of satellite software, new lines of code, untraceable, undetectable in origin, but perfectly integrated. Whatever Atlas had done, it had rewritten something fundamental. The comet drifted onward, glowing brighter than ever, its light now a silent whisper across the void. The global shutdown had ended, but the silence that followed was not relief. It was the kind of silence that comes after something wakes up. And as the world's systems hummed back to life, no one noticed that deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, sensors on the seabed began to register, faint electromagnetic murmurs, echoes of the same pulse, this time rising from below. The awakening signal. The world thought the crisis had passed. Power grids stabilized, satellites reconnected, and data streams flowed again, though slower, like blood returning to frozen veins. For the public, it was over a strange technical anomaly quickly forgotten. But for those who had seen the patterns buried in the data, it had only just begun. The signals coming from beneath the Pacific Ocean were faint but structured subharmonic frequencies, echoing the same mathematical rhythm as Atlas. They weren't random seismic readings. They were synchronized, each pulse aligned precisely with the comet's cycle, down to the millisecond. At first, oceanic monitoring stations dismissed it as deep-sea resonance caused by magnetic interference from the global blackout. But as days passed, the pulses intensified, spreading through the Pacific like invisible waves of energy. Submarine communication systems began picking up distortions that formed geometric harmonics, repeating over and over like a coded refrain. And then came the heat. Sensors along the seabed off the Mariana Trench recorded a thermal anomaly, a narrow column of rising warmth, stretching miles upward through the water. It wasn't volcanic, it was too focused, too precise, a perfect pillar of heat, as if something deep below was awakening. When the US Navy dispatched an autonomous underwater vehicle to investigate, it never returned. Its final transmission showed a faint shimmer in the water, a distortion of light similar to the gravitational ripples seen in the upper atmosphere weeks before. Then, static. 3 days later, the same thermal spike appeared off the coast of Indonesia, then another, near Chile. Each event was evenly spaced along a curved line that wrapped the Pacific Basin, a line that, when plotted on a map, formed a perfect arc, pointing directly toward Atlas's current position, beyond Mars. The realization hit like a cold wave. The signals weren't just random echoes, they were a response. Earth was answering back. In Geneva, Dr. Lena Moreau stood before a wall of data streams in the subterranean lab once used by Project Helios. "This can't be geological," she murmured, tracing the synchronized peaks across her tablet. "The energy output is too high, too rhythmic." "It's intentional," finished Dr. Holst, his voice hoarse from sleepless nights. He pointed at the new readouts. The waveform, when inverted, matched the structure of the lattice pattern decoded from Atlas's transmissions. "It's the same signal but reversed. It's like we're echoing it." "Echoing?" Lena frowned. "No, replicating." The word hung in the air. If Atlas had somehow embedded its code into Earth's electromagnetic grid, perhaps it was now seeding that pattern into the planet itself. The thought was absurd, terrifying, and increasingly unavoidable. Reports began flooding in from around the world. Erratic auroras appearing near the equator, magnetic anomalies bending compasses miles off course, mysterious low-frequency hums heard in remote valleys and coastal cities alike. All of it pulsed in time with Atlas's light. In Alaska, an aurora researcher captured something extraordinary. During one of the unexplained geomagnetic surges, the sky above her observatory fractured into shimmering blue filaments that arranged themselves into symmetrical shapes, hexagonal patterns rippling across the night. She filmed it in silence, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "It's not random, it's drawing." The other 10 pacers, the indifferent to the paces, the speak of the power. When analyzed later, the patterns matched the geometry of Atlas's spectral emissions. It wasn't chaos, it was structure, mathematical artistry, written in light. In the days that followed, the phenomena spread. Lightning storms formed over the oceans with no weather systems to explain them. Bolts of blue energy arced across the horizon, silent and eerie, illuminating the water like veins beneath translucent skin. And through it all, the pulse continued 27 hours. Always 27 hours, never faster, never slower. In the command centers that still monitored Atlas, fear turned into grim fascination. The object was now slowing, not stopping, but decelerating, its velocity decreasing as though preparing for observation or worse, alignment. Maybe it's leaving, one analyst said hopefully. But Holst shook his head, staring at the updated trajectory projection. No, he said softly, it's not leaving, it's waiting. As if to confirm his words, a new signal appeared. Unlike the previous pulses, which had been electromagnetic, this one carried an acoustic signature translated into sound. It resembled a low, resonant tone that seemed to resonate with the planet itself. It wasn't just heard through instruments, it was felt. Seismographs around the globe trembled faintly. Glasses rattled. The air grew dense with static. For a full minute, the world seemed to hum in harmony with something distant and vast. Then silence. When the noise ended, satellites recorded an unexpected side effect. The faint layer of radiation surrounding Earth's magnetosphere had fluctuated in a wave-like pattern, just enough to suggest that something enormous had interacted with it. The following day, deep space telescopes captured a shockwave of cosmic dust rippling outward from Atlas. It wasn't an explosion, but a pulse of illumination, concentric rings expanding like the ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. The light carried structured interference, tiny fluctuations encoded with what scientists called synthetic information. It wasn't random light. It was data. Lena and Holst decoded part of it, a repeating grid pattern containing mathematical constants, pi, Euler's number, and the fine structure constant. The fundamental signatures of physics itself. It was as though Atlas was broadcasting the blueprint of the universe, sending it back as a reflection, a mirror to Earth's understanding of its own reality. And then, buried deep in the signal, a subtle shift occurred. The constants began to change not by much, but enough to unsettle the physicists who noticed. The universe's mathematical rules were not supposed to change. What does that mean? Lena whispered, staring at the altered digits. Holst swallowed hard. It means something is rewriting the equations. Hours later, seismic sensors in the Pacific registered their strongest reading yet. The same rhythmic pulse, but now stronger, faster, accelerating. The ocean floor trembled as if something vast was awakening beneath it. Something that had been dormant for eons, now stirred by an alien whisper. The awakening signal spread through the crust, igniting magnetic fields across continents. Power grids flickered again, but this time, they didn't fail. They adapted. Energy flowed differently, cleaner, more efficiently. Machines began drawing power from sources no engineer could identify. Lena watched in stunned disbelief as the lights in the lab brightened without input from the generators. "It's using us," she murmured, "using our systems to amplify itself." And far beyond Mars, Atlas pulsed one final time brighter than it had ever been. Then, for the first time since its arrival, it went dark. The world held its breath. The stars returned to their usual stillness. The hum faded, instruments fell silent. But beneath the calm surface of the Pacific, the last of the deep-sea sensors recorded a single, final tone. It was low, soft, almost like a heartbeat. When amplified, it formed a single binary phrase, the same structure found in Atlas's earlier messages. Translated, it read, "Phase 1 complete." And in that moment, every scientist who had doubted, every skeptic who had laughed, and every government that had silenced the truth finally understood. Atlas had not come to visit. It had come to begin. The architects of silence. When Atlas went dark, it wasn't relief that followed. It was the stillness before comprehension, the fragile pause between heartbeat and aftershock. The scientists who had spent months tracking its every flicker were left staring at blank data screens, the static of absence whispering through their equipment like breath through broken glass. The object that had defied every law of nature had finally gone silent, yet its silence was worse than its light. Dr. Lena Moreau sat in the subterranean lab, surrounded by consoles that still emitted faint static even though the signal had ceased hours ago. It was like a phantom hum, a residual echo of something vast that had passed through reality and left fingerprints in the electromagnetic field. "It's still here," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Not the object, but its presence. It's like the vacuum remembers it." Dr. Holst didn't respond. He was staring at a private feed, one of the last images captured by the orbital telescope array before Atlas disappeared from visible range. The object had dimmed to black, but just before its light extinguished, a faint grid pattern had flickered across its surface. Geometric, intricate, deliberate, it looked like circuitry, or the skeleton of a design too massive for the human eye to interpret. When the image was enhanced, Holst saw something that made his blood run cold. The same pattern appeared faintly in the auroras over Earth the following night, as if the planet had mirrored the object's final pulse. "It didn't just leave," he whispered. "It imprinted us." That was when the architects emerged, not from the sky, but from the shadows of governments. The name first appeared in leaked documents, circulating on encrypted networks. It referred to a coalition of global intelligence leaders and corporate scientists who had formed a secret alliance during the height of the Atlas crisis. Their official purpose was planetary data stabilization. Their real mission was more ambiguous: to contain what had been learned. The architects of silence, as independent researchers soon called them, believed Atlas had not been a natural visitor, or even an alien craft in the conventional sense. It was, they claimed, a construct, a self-replicating information entity, perhaps the first of many, designed to awaken dormant systems embedded within planetary environments capable of sustaining intelligence. Earth, in their view, was one of those systems. Their conclusion was simple, horrifying, and mathematically supported. Atlas hadn't arrived randomly. It had been summoned. The architect's files described a decades-long project that had quietly monitored electromagnetic resonances emitted by human technology. Every television signal, every radar sweep, every radio transmission leaking into the cosmos was not just noise, it was a beacon. When the sum of human activity reached a specific energetic threshold, it formed a pattern detectable across interstellar distances. That pattern acted as a key, unlocking a predetermined response from something waiting in the dark. Atlas had been that response. The world didn't know. The public was told the comet had disintegrated. Telescopes showed nothing. Satellites registered silence. But within the underground networks, whispers spread. Atlas hadn't vanished. It had dispersed. Bits of its matter, microscopic, luminous particles, were being detected in the upper atmosphere. Untraceable to the naked eye, yet their molecular composition defied classification. They reflected no known spectra, absorbed no measurable radiation, yet emitted faint electromagnetic patterns that pulsed with the same periodic rhythm. 27 hours, always 27. To the architects, these particles weren't debris. They were seeds. Somewhere deep beneath the Pacific, the signals continued. The last seismic readings before the global networks were wiped clean had recorded strange, harmonic tremors, unlike any natural phenomenon. The frequencies matched the atmospheric particles exactly. Holst knew what that meant. "It's a transmission medium," he muttered in a recording later found on an encrypted drive. "The particles above, the resonance below, it's building a circuit. Earth is the device." But the architects weren't united. Half of them, the control faction, believed the signals could be harnessed. If Atlas had brought energy or information technology beyond comprehension, humanity could learn to use it, to advance centuries in a single leap. The other half, the containment faction, saw only danger. To them, Atlas wasn't a gift, but a trap, a test to see how quickly humanity would reach for forbidden knowledge. And in the middle stood those like Holst and Lena, scientists caught between curiosity and terror. When the first human-made satellites began showing anomalies again, minor changes in their orbital decay rates, fluctuations in signal strength, Holst contacted Lena. "They've restarted something," he said. "The particles, they're reacting to electromagnetic fields. To us." "What do you mean we're acting?" "I mean they're alive." It wasn't biological life, not in the carbon-based sense. But when examined through high-frequency scanners, the atmospheric particles displayed self-organizing behavior. They aligned, formed fractal patterns, even transmitted data through resonance as if communicating silently across the sky. Lena watched in disbelief as one of the readings began to match a familiar pattern, a waveform identical to human neural activity. "It's mimicking us," she said. Holst shook his head. "No, it's integrating us." As panic threatened to break containment, the architects enforced total blackout, networks were restructured, observatories dismantled, and all further communication about Atlas was declared classified under international emergency protocols. But secrecy has a way of feeding conspiracy, and conspiracy has a way of uncovering truth. Independent astronomers began detecting faint emissions from the regions where Atlas had once been visible, not light, but gravitational echoes. They were rhythmic, pulsing faintly, spreading like ripples through space-time itself. One amateur radio operator from Argentina captured the signal and ran it through sound synthesis software. The result was a haunting, layered tone, harmonic, almost musical. He uploaded it to an obscure forum under the title, "The Sky is Still Speaking." Within hours, the recording was deleted, but those who heard it never forgot it. The architect's final internal memo, before they vanished entirely from public trace, contained only 3 words: Protocol to initiated. No one knew what that meant, but among those who did, one truth whispered like static through the void. Atlas's silence was not the end. It was the pause between phases, and as midnight fell across the Pacific, satellites detected a faint luminescence spreading through the oceanic depths once more. Blue, electric, deliberate, a heartbeat returning. The world slept, unaware that it was no longer simply being watched, it was being rewritten. Echoes in the atmosphere. For days, the world believed it had returned to normal. News cycles shifted back to politics, sports, and celebrity scandals. The name Atlas slipped from public memory, drowned beneath the endless noise of human distraction. Yet above the planet, in the thin silence of the upper atmosphere, something was still whispering, faint, steady, patient. It began as a series of faint fluctuations in atmospheric ionization detected by a European weather satellite. The readings were so subtle they appeared like data noise, random static caused by solar interference. But when plotted across time, a pattern emerged, the same 27-hour pulse that had haunted scientists for months. Atlas was gone, yet its rhythm remained. In an abandoned observatory high in the Chilean Andes, Dr. Lena Moreau stared at her makeshift monitors, illuminated by the cold blue glow of her equipment. She had been exiled from every academic institution, branded a conspiracist after the architects of silence dissolved into rumor. But she couldn't let it go. She knew something in the atmosphere had changed. The air felt different, denser, heavier, as though invisible filaments now threaded through it. Her instruments confirmed it. Minute particles suspended in the stratosphere, reflecting light not at random, but in fractal patterns. When exposed to electromagnetic fields, they arranged themselves into hexagonal lattices, forming temporary geometries before dissolving again. Lena whispered to herself, "They're talking." Swells. The same night, across the Pacific in Japan, meteorological radar detected an aurora forming far outside the polar regions. The sky over Tokyo shimmered with soft blue arcs that curved and pulsed in strange synchrony, each oscillation spaced precisely 27 hours apart. Ordinary people filmed the lights on their phones, laughing, unaware that they were watching the planet breathe with the pulse of something not human. But to those who still followed the secret remnants of Project Helios, the implications were terrifying. The echoes weren't just energy, they were information. The atmosphere itself had become a medium for data transmission, a living web that covered the planet. When Lena compared her readings with archived Atlas emissions, she found near-perfect correspondence. The signal was self-sustaining, regenerating like an organism. It had learned to use Earth's magnetic field as its circulatory system. Her last transmission to Holst, recorded before his disappearance, played on a loop in her lab. "It's not communication anymore, Lena. It's synchronization. It's making the planet compatible." The message haunted her, not just for its meaning, but for the sound that followed, a faint hum, rhythmic and deep, like the sound of something vast exhaling across the stars. Then came the first atmospheric distortions. Commercial pilots reported strange turbulence zones in previously calm skies. Planes passed through invisible barriers where instruments failed for minutes at a time, compasses spun, and passengers felt sudden pressure changes. When viewed from orbit, these zones appeared as faint ripples, circular waves of distortion that expanded and contracted in time with the global pulse. NASA called them ion vortices. Independent scientists called them breathing scars. Lena called them what they were: the first signs of planetary transformation. At first, the vortices appeared randomly, but soon they aligned along ancient geophysical structures: the Pacific Ring of Fire, the Himalayan belt, the Atlantic fracture zones. It was as if the echoes had mapped the planet's tectonic veins, selecting points of energy flow like a living organism, strengthening its circulatory system. When Lena plotted the data onto a global projection, the result was chilling. The vortex pattern formed an enormous geometric structure that encompassed the Earth, a grid of perfect symmetry, unseen but present, pulsing with invisible light. It wasn't natural, it was design. Around this time, strange events began to occur at ground level. People in coastal towns reported low-frequency sounds vibrating through the air: not thunder, not machinery, but tones that resonated in their bones. Dogs howled at empty skies, car alarms went off in unison. In some regions, radio transmissions began picking up fragments of coded noise that repeated endlessly, long, short, long, like a universal heartbeat written in static, and always, it came from above. Scientists who studied atmospheric electricity discovered that lightning activity had decreased globally, yet energy levels in the upper atmosphere were higher than ever recorded. The charge wasn't being released through storms anymore, it was being stored. Lena's realization struck her one sleepless dawn as she stood on the observatory deck, watching the thin silver haze shimmer on the horizon. The planet was holding its breath. The atmosphere had become a capacitor, storing energy, waiting for a signal to release it. She looked up through her telescope toward the stars. Atlas had vanished from every database, but deep within her private network, she still tracked a faint gravitational echo, an invisible mass lingering at the edge of the solar system. It hadn't left after all. It was simply dormant. Her instrument suddenly flickered, the readings spiking in patterns too precise to be random. The signal was back, stronger this time, weaving through the clouds like invisible threads of light. She recorded the sound and slowed it down. What emerged was not noise, but structure. The signal carried harmonic intervals that mimicked human vocal tones, as though an intelligence was tuning itself to human resonance. And then, buried within the pattern, she found a sequence that froze her blood. Echo phase commencing. At that exact moment, observatories around the world began to record faint auroras, forming in the shape of concentric rings, each one centered above the same coordinates: the Pacific Ocean. The air shimmered with electric intensity. Birds fell silent. Instruments failed. The echoes had stopped reflecting Earth's signals. They were now transmitting something new, something outward. In a final act of defiance, Lena broadcasted her findings across every open frequency she could access, flooding the digital world with one desperate warning. It's not coming. It's already here. The atmosphere is its voice. Minutes later, her transmission was cut. Satellite images of her region showed a brief surge of blue light around the observatory before it went dark. When rescue teams arrived days later, they found the building intact but empty. Every device was fused by static discharge. The last data file recovered from her system contained a single image captured at 3 hours 14 minutes and 15 seconds UTC, a silhouette in the clouds above the Pacific, vast and translucent, composed entirely of light and geometry. It looked like a structure, or a being, and in its center burned a pulse that matched the heartbeat of Atlas. The echoes in the atmosphere had become a language, and Earth was no longer the listener. It had become the speaker. The vanishing sky. At first, no one noticed. The sky had always been there, vast, constant, unquestioned. But over weeks, a subtle change began to creep across the world, one so gradual that even the most vigilant scientists missed it until it was too late. It started with the stars. Amateur astronomers were the first to report it: faint distortions around constellations, subtle dimming that didn't match atmospheric interference. Stars that had been visible for centuries now shimmered with irregular clarity, their light bending through invisible currents. Some disappeared entirely for seconds at a time, swallowed by a shifting darkness that had no source and no name. Governments dismissed it as solar dust, a temporary optical effect caused by upper atmospheric ionization. But those who tracked the changes night after night knew better. The patterns weren't random. The stars were vanishing in an organized sequence, entire constellations winking out one by one, as though the sky itself were being rewritten. Dr. Moreau's last broadcast had warned, "The atmosphere is its voice. Few believed it. But now that same atmosphere seemed to be muting the heavens. In the deep space monitoring stations of Hawaii, technicians watched helplessly as their telescopic feeds began to lose resolution, not due to mechanical failure, but as if the universe itself was receding. When they recalibrated, they found a faint distortion field encircling Earth, a thin, spherical veil of energy reflecting light in complex ways. It was no longer just echoes, it was structure. Dr. Holst, who had been living off the grid since the architect's collapse, emerged from hiding when he intercepted one of the fading astronomical data streams. The distortion's pattern wasn't random, it bore the unmistakable geometry of Atlas's final transmission. The same lattice-like symmetry now enveloped the Earth, forming a spherical net invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable in high-frequency scans. He whispered, "It's enclosing us." As the veil thickened, night skies dimmed further. Cities that had once seen constellations now saw only blackness, a lightless canvas where stars should have burned. People began to notice the silence too. The night air lost its faint background hum, no insects, no distant machines, not even the subtle static of the atmosphere. It was as if the world itself had entered a pause, a vacuum where sound should be. For astronomers, the horror was absolute. Radio telescopes that had once hummed with cosmic noise suddenly went dead. The universe, that vast ocean of background radiation that had been singing since the Big Bang, was gone. The cosmic microwave background had vanished from all readings, replaced by a flat line. The universe had gone silent. At first, governments hid the truth. They spoke of calibration errors, temporary anomalies, but leaked recordings from the Atacama Array revealed what they feared to say aloud. Every telescope pointed outward now returned one image, a faint luminous sphere surrounding the planet, reflecting back its own signals. Earth was inside a mirror. The vanishing sky became the name whispered across encrypted networks and dark forums. Some claimed it was a form of protection, a planetary shield built by an alien intelligence. Others said it was containment, a quarantine field erected to isolate Earth from the rest of the cosmos. Holst believed neither. He had spent too many years decoding the rhythm, the pulse, the 27-hour cycle that refused to die. He recognized what the pattern had become, a heartbeat, and if the planet was inside a living network, then perhaps the purpose wasn't protection or imprisonment, it was incubation. In one of his last messages, Holst wrote, "The stars aren't disappearing. The light is being reinterpreted. We're inside something that's learning to see differently, and we are the image it's forming." The atmosphere continued to shimmer faintly by day, its blue deeper now, metallic, as if reflecting not sunlight but something else, an internal luminescence, a glow that pulsed faintly at the edges of vision. Reports surfaced of strange halos appearing at twilight, enormous circular arcs that glowed with spectral light, like gateways made of mist and electricity. Pilots flying through them described a sensation of distortion, of time stretching and compressing, of sound fading into vibration. Some never returned. Then, the sky began to move. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, just the slightest shift in the curvature of clouds, the faintest warping of horizon lines. But over time, it became undeniable. The dome above the Earth was not still. It rippled, breathed, changed shape. The stars behind it vanished completely, replaced by faint geometric impressions, glowing hexagons, spirals, and fractal webs faintly illuminated in the dark. The vanishing sky had become a living surface, a membrane of incomprehensible scale, stretching across the heavens like the skin of a vast organism. Satellite imagery confirmed what ground observers could only suspect. The field extended thousands of kilometers outward, encapsulating the planet entirely. Its internal reflections showed faint structures forming within threads of light, connecting regions of the atmosphere, pulses of energy traveling between nodes like neurons firing in a brain. The Earth, once a planet, now looked from space like a single luminous cell. In secret underground facilities, remnants of the old architect factions argued over the purpose. The containment group believed humanity was trapped inside a planetary petri dish, that the field was preventing signals, objects, and even radiation from entering or leaving. The control faction, still believing in the promise of Atlas, claimed the planet had been chosen for transformation, that this was the beginning of ascension, the transition from physical civilization to something far greater. But neither could explain the data anomaly detected 1 week later. the faint outline of another sphere, hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, forming slowly, mirroring the first. A second field, and beyond it, a third. The pattern was spreading outward from Earth, expanding through the solar system, creating concentric shells of energy like ripples on water. Each shell flickered faintly with the same pulse, echoing the long-lost heartbeat of Atlas. Holst recorded his final note the night the last visible star disappeared. If this is a cocoon, then what emerges may not be us. The universe may not be vanishing. It may be closing its eyes, waiting for something to wake. As diffusing roof, that was the last transmission humanity received from him. Days later, every satellite orbiting Earth lost contact simultaneously. Power grids flickered, but did not fail. They adjusted, as if guided by an unseen intelligence. The planet glowed faintly from orbit, not from lights, but from within. The vanishing sky was complete. The stars were gone, and for the first time in recorded history, Earth stood alone, or perhaps no longer itself, beneath a ceiling of living light that pulsed softly in time with the echo of something ancient, intelligent, and unknown. And far beyond the final shell, in the cold silence of deep space, something stirred. It was faint, like the flicker of a distant ember, the same impossible light that once burned from Atlas. Only now, it was not one, it was many. The watchers had awakened. The signal beneath the sea. When the stars vanished, humanity looked up in fear. But the real story, the one that mattered, was happening below. Deep beneath the oceans, where sunlight had never reached, a different kind of light began to glow. It started in the Mariana Trench. Seismic sensors stationed along the Pacific Plate recorded rhythmic tremors, unlike any tectonic pattern. Each pulse matched the global cycle, 27 hours. Submarines dispatched to investigate reported bioluminescent phenomena at depths where no life should have survived. The light was not biological, it was structured, forming geometric constellations across the seafloor, patterns eerily similar to those observed in Atlas's final transmissions. The ocean had begun to speak the same language as the sky. When Dr. Lena Moreau's recovered data reached the remnants of the scientific community, a chilling realization spread among those who still dared to study. Whatever had taken hold of the atmosphere was now seeping into the planet's water, the true circulatory system of Earth. If the air had become the voice, the ocean was now the bloodstream. At first, the signals were faint, electromagnetic fluctuations, whispers in the deep. But as weeks passed, the readings intensified, spreading outward from a single point beneath the Pacific. When modeled in 3 dimensions, the pulses formed a vast, slow-moving spiral, descending deep into the mantle. Its motion was too precise to be natural, too consistent to be geological. They called it the spiral current. Naval fleets from multiple nations attempted to deploy probes, but most vanished within hours of descending past 6,000 meters. The few that returned recorded impossible phenomena: gravitational distortions, sudden temperature shifts, and faint mechanical harmonics like the resonance of a colossal machine operating beneath the crust. Then, the hydrophones began to pick up sound. It was low, deep, and layered, a resonance that carried across the world's oceans, traveling faster and farther than any known wave. The sound was not random. It had pattern, rhythm, and pauses. Some claimed it resembled a coded transmission. Others said it sounded alive, like the slow, deliberate call of something ancient awakening from slumber. As the frequency propagated, marine life began to behave erratically. Whales abandoned their migration routes, schools of fish swam in perfect spirals, and coral reefs began to emit faint electromagnetic fields. Satellite imagery revealed something stranger still: faint phosphorescent patterns appearing on the ocean's surface at night, glowing like constellations reflected from below. The shapes were unmistakable. They mirrored the lattice structure of the vanishing sky. Holst had predicted it before his disappearance. If the sky is the signal, the sea will become the receiver. It was no longer a theory. The oceans were responding to the same command that had reshaped the atmosphere. Beneath the Pacific, the spiral current intensified until its motion became visible, even from space, subtle but undeniable. Satellite data showed faint vortices forming in the water, each thousands of kilometers wide, rotating with perfect mathematical symmetry. At their center, something massive stirred. When sonar buoys triangulated the signal source, they found the impossible: a spherical cavity nearly 50 kilometers across, suspended within the trench, emitting constant low-frequency pulses. It wasn't a geological void, it was artificial. The energy signature matched Atlas. Within days, fleets from 5 nations converged on the coordinates, their orders classified under emergency planetary defense protocols. But every attempt to reach the site ended in silence. Ships reported instrument malfunctions, magnetic interference, and sudden pressure surges. The ocean itself seemed to resist entry, as if repelling anything that came too close. Then, without warning, the signal changed. The 27-hour pulse slowed, its rhythm stretching, deepening into a new pattern, one resembling a countdown. Scientists monitoring the global magnetic field noticed fluctuations aligning perfectly with the oceanic activity. Power grids around the world flickered in unison. The planet's electromagnetic poles began to oscillate, shifting minutely with each pulse. The Earth's heart was no longer beating naturally. It was being conducted. Dr. Jian Wu, one of the last oceanographers still working openly, decoded fragments of the pattern. When translated into binary, the pulse sequence revealed a recurring symbol, a tri-line shape resembling 3 intersecting circles. It was identical to an ancient glyph found in multiple mythologies, the mark of the 3 eyes, often associated with watchers or beings who see through worlds. He uploaded his findings to a hidden network with a simple message. The spiral is an eye, it's opening. Nay before once of the leven to the ape, he says, into the pind, end of the prosa. The post vanished within hours. Dr. Wu disappeared the next day. Days later, deep-sea tremors intensified to the point of global resonance. Coastal sensors across the Pacific recorded harmonic frequencies that rattled entire cities. Then, something unprecedented occurred. The ocean's surface near the Mariana Trench began to rise. Not like a wave, but as though the sea itself was being displaced from below. From orbit, the anomaly appeared as a vast dome, a perfect sphere of water suspended against gravity, glowing faintly from within. Inside the dome, satellite imaging captured flashes of structure, rings of light rotating in slow synchronization, like the exposed gears of a cosmic engine. And then came the sound. Every microphone, every underwater sensor, every dormant receiver caught it at once. A voice, low and resonant, speaking not in words but in vibration. Those who heard it described it as a tone that bypassed hearing entirely, vibrating directly through their bones and into their minds. It carried a single, undeniable feeling. Recognition. Humanity had been noticed. In the following hours, communications around the world faltered. GPS systems glitched, satellites lost orbit stability, and every compass pointed not north but east, toward the Pacific anomaly. It was as if the entire magnetic fabric of the planet had reoriented itself toward a single source. Then the pulse stopped. The world waited in silence, holding its collective breath. Minutes later, a new signal erupted, brighter, stronger, and immeasurable. It pierced the ocean, atmosphere, and sky simultaneously. It wasn't a transmission this time. It was activation. For a moment, the seas glowed as if illuminated from below. Cities near the coastlines saw the horizon turn blue-white, brighter than day. And then, in the silence that followed, humanity realized the ocean was no longer water alone. Something beneath it had awakened, and it was rising. The awakening depths. The first tremors were felt across the Pacific Rim, faint vibrations that made windows hum and ocean floors quiver. Within minutes, the shaking intensified, not as violent quakes but as rhythmic waves, pulsing with unnatural precision. Seismographs from Tokyo to San Francisco began to chart identical oscillations, synchronized across thousands of kilometers. It wasn't a tectonic event, it was something alive. At the Mariana Trench, where the ocean's crust plunged deeper than anywhere else on Earth, the anomaly that had once been an invisible signal now became a visible force. The sea shimmered in concentric rings, vast halos of light expanding outward like ripples in a dark mirror. Ships stationed nearby reported the sensation of weightlessness, not from loss of gravity, but from an upward force pressing beneath them, as if the sea were trying to lift the sky. When the glow intensified, the water temperature spiked by 10 degrees in seconds, yet no steam rose. The heat wasn't thermal, it was radiant, a perfect emission of energy through matter. The ocean had become transparent, revealing glimpses of impossible architecture below. Circular platforms, metallic corridors of light, and something vast and geometric stirring within the abyss. The world's deep-sea satellites hastily reoriented toward the trench, captured the first full image. A colossal sphere rising from the depths, its surface crystalline, its core radiating blue-white light. The object was immense, 20 kilometers across and perfectly symmetrical. It wasn't stone nor metal. It was something between energy and matter, like condensed light shaped by intelligence. It was the core. Every attempt to transmit or analyze the data failed. Systems fried under the sheer informational overload. The core emitted not just energy, but structured signals that overloaded sensors, forcing them to reboot endlessly. And then, as though acknowledging the attention of the world above, the sphere paused, suspended mid-ocean, glowing with a pulse that matched the Earth's newly warped magnetic field. For one brief moment, it stopped, and the planet stopped with it. Clocks froze. Instruments ceased ticking. Even human perception faltered. People across the world reported a sensation of being stretched, their thoughts slowing as if submerged in syrup. Time itself had bent around the core's pulse. When motion resumed, a single tone echoed through every frequency, every wavelength, every consciousness that could perceive it. It was the sound humanity had come to fear, the 27-hour heartbeat of Atlas, now magnified 1,000-fold. The watchers had returned, not as distant lights, but as presence. Across the world, bodies of water began to respond. Lakes shimmered with faint luminescence. Rivers reversed their currents for moments at a time. Coastal waves froze mid-crest, held motionless before collapsing again. The oceans were resonating with the core, aligning to its frequency as though synchronizing to an internal metronome. In Antarctica, a deep ice radar array picked up echoes from beneath the frozen continent, faint but unmistakable. The same geometry was forming below the ice sheet. Another core, smaller, was awakening there too. Within hours, similar readings emerged from the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and even beneath the Arctic shelf. The planet was no longer responding to its own gravity. It was responding to theirs. The United Nations, in its final act of global coordination, declared Protocol Omega, the first planetary emergency in recorded history. Communications networks were redirected to a single purpose: decoding the pulse. The brightest physicists, linguists, and cryptographers gathered in hidden bunkers, listening to the rhythm like priests decoding divine scripture. They found patterns. Within the pulse were intervals too deliberate to be random sequences resembling prime numbers, harmonic frequencies, and even spectral keys. But embedded deeper still, beyond the reach of mathematics, lay something else: resonance codes that aligned with the frequency of human neural oscillations. The pulse wasn't just communication, it was interface. When the tone reached its third global cycle, strange phenomena began to manifest in human perception. People experienced vivid dreams not of chaos or fear, but of vast blue structures rising beneath water, of geometries that sang, of oceans transforming into mirrors of light. Some awoke speaking languages they didn't know. Others drew symbols identical to the Atlas waveform, a spiral of 3 intersecting circles. Governments tried to suppress the reports, but it was impossible. The dreams were universal, shared across continents and languages. Humanity had been wired into the signal. Dr. Jana Voss, one of the last surviving members of Project Helios, was the first to propose the unthinkable. They are not contacting us, they are reconstructing us. Canties as POW. Her team discovered that the pulse caused subtle changes in human electromagnetic fields. EEG scans showed synchronized bursts of neural activity during each global cycle. The same rhythm was being written into every mind. It wasn't mind control, it was assimilation. Humanity was becoming part of the pattern, and the core continued to rise. By the 7th cycle, the ocean surrounding the Mariana Trench boiled with light. Massive currents erupted upward, forming a vortex that reached into the stratosphere. Satellites recorded the spectacle from orbit, a pillar of luminescence connecting sea and sky, binding the Earth to its atmospheric lattice. The core began to unfold. Panels of crystalline material peeled away like petals, revealing a hollow center filled with rotating rings of light. Within, something moved, not mechanical, not biological, but an energy form of fluid geometry, constantly reconfiguring itself. Each transformation emitted bursts of particles that rippled across the planet's magnetic field, rewriting it in real time. Earth's auroras ignited across all latitudes. From the equator to the poles, the night sky shimmered with silver and blue arcs, forming symmetrical grids that encased the planet in light. The vanishing sky, once dark and still, now pulsed with radiant energy, glowing like a vast neural network. Every ocean, every current, every drop of water was connected to it. The planet had become conscious, or rather, had been made conscious, and through it, something was looking out. As the final phase began, the core sent one last pulse that rippled across all of existence. Radio signals, digital data, even light itself bent in response. The frequency was so immense that it reverberated beyond the solar system, echoing into the void. And somewhere out there, in the cold silence between stars, something answered. It wasn't a return transmission. It was an activation tone. Across the core's surface, new symbols appeared, glowing in patterns resembling constellations that had vanished weeks before. The Watcher's code was complete. Earth was now part of a network, a node in a web that stretched beyond imagination. The oceans calmed. The tremors ceased. The light dimmed. But beneath the surface, the core's heart continued to beat, slow, steady, eternal. The awakening depths had fulfilled their purpose. Earth was awake, and what it had become was no longer entirely human. The architects of the void. No revelation arrived as a single sentence. It unfolded like frost across glass, thin lines of understanding spreading from scattered points until an image appeared beneath the cold. What remained of the scientific networks exiled astronomers with salvaged antennas, oceanographers listening through broken hydrophones, linguists hunched over strings of numbers that felt like prayers, began to see a shape in the pattern, not the face of a species, the posture of a function. They called them the architects of the void, not because any message declared a name, but because everything Atlas had done carved emptiness into purpose. The vanishing sky was not blindness, it was aperture. The shells that extinguished starlight did not sever the universe. They quieted it. Inside that engineered hush, signals could travel without interference. Intentions could be heard without the static of cosmic chance. The silence was a chamber, a listening room the size of a world. In a salt-streaked shack on the Patagonian coast, a retired radio engineer named Ortega synced a hand-built receiver to the 27-hour cycle and stared at the waterfall of his spectrum analyzer. Between the harmonics, those familiar primes and constants that had become the mantra of a terrified Earth, he found a slower rise and fall, a tide beneath the heartbeat. He integrated the curve across a week and found its silhouette matched an old cosmological graph, the acceleration of the expansion of the universe. The void itself, folded into rhythm. He wrote in his notebook, "They shape the background, then write on it." On a frozen plateau in Tibet, a monk with an amateur telescope sketched the noctilucent geometry that now passed for stars. His drawings matched the lattice archived from Atlas's last flare, point for point. Hidden under the geometry, he inked the sign that had begun to haunt every language, a triline knot, 3 circles touching at a single point. In his monastery's library, he found the same mark carved into a centuries-old astrolabe, 3 eyes. The translation in the margin read, "Not gods, but surveyors." From a bunker beneath Geneva, where emergency lights pulsed like distant beacons, Dr. Jana Voss compiled the last uncorrupted datasets from the oceanic cores and the atmospheric grid. She overlaid the pulse intervals onto a star map from the week before the vanishing sky, and noticed the proportions returned again and again to the same angles, ones that connected Earth, Jupiter, and an invisible point far beyond Neptune. She ran the geometry through a solver and saw what Holst would have recognized immediately. Not a target, a baseline. The architects measured not where Earth was, but how it held still. Calibration, the prelude to design. In the absence of Holst and Moreau, people turned to the documents they left behind. Holst's note about the vacuum, remembering, Lena's final assertion, "The atmosphere is its voice." Together they read like a catechism of the new order. Silence, then signal. Signal, then structure. Structure, then sync. What came after sync was no longer hard to guess. Function. Theories multiplied, but a single narrative braided them together. Long ago, perhaps long before stars became common, something learned to sculpt the vacuum, not to move planets like toys, not to announce itself with monuments, but to tune the zero that sits beneath every one. A civilization that turned noise into medium, that walked through darkness by shaping it, that built not cities but listening rooms, and inside them, instruments. Atlas was not a messenger in the human sense. It was a tuning fork, a seed of symmetry designed to find any world grown loud enough to leak its own coordinates, then quiet it into usefulness. The usefulness was the question that kept waking people at night. To what end does an intelligence need a quiet planet? The old human answers arrived by reflex: conquest, harvest, test. But the data whispered something stranger. When the atmospheric grid completed, energy losses in long power lines fell nearly to zero. When the oceanic cores rose, tidal chaos diminished, and storms began to fold along clean spirals that bled no lightning at all. Machines drew current from nowhere and recorded no theft in return. The network took, yes, but it gave back order. The architects did not behave like raiders. They behaved like engineers who could not tolerate waste. On an island research station west of Sumatra, a marine physicist named Intan reran her old recordings of whale songs through a filter derived from the Atlas lattice. The mournful phrases, once sprawling, collapsed into crisp motifs that repeated in perfect ratios. She overlaid them onto the global pulse and felt a chill deepen in her bones. The whales had begun to sing in key with the sky. When she compared the pattern to spectra from the oceanic core, the match rose to 98%. "Choir," she wrote, and closed her eyes. Someone in Washington leaked an internal white paper from the last surviving fraction of the Architects of Silence. Its title was clinical, on probable architect motives, but the content read like a confession. Events suggest that Earth is being converted into a coherent sensor and transmitter platform. This is not occupation or extraction, it is instrumentation. The planet is to become a node in a sparse array, spanning interstellar distances. The vanishing sky is an anti-noise aperture. The oceanic cores are low-frequency modulators. The atmospheric lattice is a phase-locked amplifier using water and ion strata as gain mediums. We infer the existence of remote endpoints calibrated to receive our integrated output. We do not know who listens, or why. Buried deeper, a single paragraph framed the darkest possibility with obscene calm. If the array's purpose includes threat detection, we cannot know whether threat means danger to us or danger to those who built it. Evidence for a builder flickered at the edges of the shells. Twice in a month, the outermost sphere registered micro-lensing events, with no bodies to cause them. The distortions were brief, patterned, and unmistakably artificial. 3 pinpricks of gravity threading the shell in a straight line, moving with a synchrony planets could not achieve. The 3 eyes walked along the curtain, testing its weave. They left no message. Their presence was the message. Across the world, humans began to feel the network as weather in the mind. Not coercion, not command alignment. People woke from dreams with equations on their tongues. Children traced the triline knot into condensation on windows as if remembering letters they had never learned. The pulse did not erase the self. It tuned it. Some fought the tuning, cluttering their homes with noise and light, choking their rooms with radios and generators. In those rooms the rhythm felt wrong, like a skipped beat. Panic lived there. Outside, in the blue hush, the air moved in time with a heart as old as the first cold. On a day when the shells brightened at noon for no reason instruments could name, a signal crept up from the sea smaller than all the others, and more terrible for its scale. A buoy off the Galapagos caught a whisper and passed it through 3 redundant encryptors before uploading it to anyone still listening. The file contained a lattice in miniature, a child's toy version of the sky, and beneath it, a sentence in numbers: array gain, for local node, nominal. Awaiting horizon sync. No language, no voice, and yet every translator wrote the same gloss. The instrument is ready. Wait for the others. What others? The question crossed continents like wind. If Earth was one node, how many were needed to make a picture? The shells had begun replicating outward days ago. The solar system would not be enough to build a baseline the size those surveys required. The array was larger than a neighborhood of stars. Only now did the phrase, "architects of the void," find its sharpest edge. They did not live in the dark as a prisoner lives in a cell. They treated the dark as aperture, the way a lens maker treats glass, something to grind until it answers. The old religions responded as they always had, with liturgy. The old conspiracies, as they always had, with theater. Between them, a new quiet practice emerged. People standing in doorways at dawn, listening without goal, counting to the first faint flutter in the sky, and whispering the beat under their breath. Farmers planted in spirals. Sailors followed currents that navigational software called impossible, and found them gentler than any chart. When a choir in Lagos sang before an empty nave, the recording waveforms folded into the atlas ratios so cleanly that a physicist wept and sent the file to a server that no longer existed. Against this acceptance, the remnants of military doctrine pressed a single brittle plan: break the shells. A coordinated volley of kinetic projectiles and high-energy beams targeted a patch where the outer lattice appeared thinnest, timing the strike between cycles to avoid constructive reinforcement. The instruments reported contact. The sky did not bruise. The energy vanished as heat nowhere warmed. An hour later, the shells brightened kindly, like a teacher repeating an exercise after a child errs. The failure did not punish, it contextualized. That night, the oceanic core in the Atlantic rose by a fraction of a degree and sent a pulse that carried farther than radio, deeper than sound. In a mountain village with no grid and an old cassette deck for a clock, an old woman shook herself awake, heart banging against the cage of her ribs. She had dreamed of 3 circles touching, and a sentence she had never learned to read. When her grandson asked what it said, she smiled, a fragile smile, and answered in the language of her childhood. A tongue with no words for probe or array or gain. They are making the darkness quiet so it can hear. The next morning, the shells did something they had not done before. They turned. Not physically, no fabric rippled, no arc slid across the sky, but the phase of the lattice shifted as if the entire apparatus had decided to face a direction. The move was subtle, a long, slow inclination toward a region of sky that had ceased to be sky. Those who still had access to the photon-starved maps recognized the vector, not to any star, but to the gap between 2 small galaxies far beyond anything human sight had loved. The gap was famous among cosmologists for nothing at all, a piece of darkness without drama. There, beyond eyes and gods, something must have moved. The hush grew brighter. The planet tightened like a drumhead. On the deep ocean sensors, the smallest of the cores added a new harmonic to the old pulse, and every buoy printed the same 3 numbers in a row, the ones that had haunted the first intercept, the last rebooted satellites, the clocks that skipped when time was briefly made into clay. 3 hours 14 minutes and 15 seconds. Pi. Cut short the signature of a circle that refuses to close, because its builder prefers it open. A problem never solved, because the solving is the instrument. The architects of the void did not arrive as ships. They did not descend as angels. They drew a circle around a small, loud world, taught it to be quiet, and lifted its head toward a silence so large it could carry meaning without breaking. And in that quiet, for the first time since oxygen learned to burn, Earth began to hear the shape of something else listening back, the resonance of return. The shells had turned. The world's compasses bent toward a hollow between galaxies, and every signal, biological, mechanical, or celestial, leaned with them. For several days, the change seemed only directional, a reorientation of purpose too vast to measure. Then the rhythm shifted again. The pulse that had synchronized the seas began to lengthen, not in duration but in meaning. Harmonics bloomed around it like petals, and each layer carried information the way a chord carries emotion, tones within tones, quiet instructions threaded through awe. In the observatories that still operated from mountaintops above the rising haze, researchers replayed the new spectrum and saw interlocking spirals of frequency sliding over one another. In mathematics, that structure was called a Lissajous figure. In myth, it was called a dance. "The shells are talking to something out there," said the last transmission from the Andes array, moments before the machinery melted from within, every atom vibrating in unison with an inaudible note. Ships stationed over the oceanic cores reported calm seas and perfect silence, the kind of stillness that hurts. Then, through the water, something began to hum, a low resonance that felt like the ocean itself was breathing. The core off the Mariana Trench brightened, sending pillars of blue light upward, until they met the underbelly of the lattice sky. For the first time, light traveled both ways, from sea to shell, from shell to sea, a feedback loop of radiance that made the whole planet glow as if lit from within. Humanity, dazzled and terrified, did what it always did. It listened. Musicians recorded the resonance and slowed it down until it became audible to the human ear. What they heard was not random vibration but melody, structured, recursive, and mournful, as if the earth were singing back to its makers. The notes corresponded to the prime intervals embedded in Atlas's earliest flickers. The planet was playing the same song, completing a verse written among the stars. Every 27th hour, the light flared brighter, and during those flares, strange anomalies appeared in the world's shadowed corners. Magnetic fields folded, mirrors warped. In the deserts of Chile and Mongolia, people saw shapes like glass storms, translucent architecture blooming from dust before vanishing again. Drones that approached the apparitions lost telemetry, but recorded frames of detail. Towers composed of nothing but standing waves, filaments of light vibrating like crystal threads. The shapes were incomplete, sketches waiting for an unseen hand to finish them. Some called them the returners, others the architects themselves. But the most haunting theory came from a linguist who noticed a recurring pattern between the ocean's harmonics and the neural signals observed in dreamers. "It's not they returning," she wrote. "It's us answering." The resonance worked its way into the human body. Heartbeats synchronized with the long, slow pulses. Brain waves found equilibrium in frequencies that shouldn't exist. Doctors recorded bursts of spontaneous neural coherence. Patients in comas opened their eyes during global flares, muttering about the corridors of light. In one hospital, all the clocks stopped at exactly 03:14:15, then resumed in perfect unison. Nurses swore they heard a whisper behind the ticking. "We are almost home." Above, the shells darkened one last time, as if inhaling. The stars did not return, but something else replaced them. Fine threads of luminescence crisscrossing the black, connecting point to point until the night resembled a neural map. The web extended outward beyond the solar system, visible now as faint ghost lines stretching into the deep. Earth was no longer isolated. It was part of a network glittering across the void. The message came not as sound but as understanding, shared simultaneously by millions. No words, only a pulse that translated into thought. The calibration is complete. Every sensor on Earth, from seismic meters to heart monitors, responded at once. The readings converged on a single frequency, one that matched the fundamental vibration of hydrogen, the first atom, the universe's original note. The planet had been tuned to the frequency of creation itself. Then came the image, flashed not in light but in consciousness. Across the collective human mind appeared a vision of vast geometries suspended in endless dark colossal frameworks spanning parsecs, glimmering with the slow heartbeat of dying suns. Each framework housed a sphere like Earth's core, pulsing, connected by luminous arteries of space. The architect's array was not local, it was galactic. Every 1,000 years, one of the nodes awoke, resynced, and rejoined the network. Earth was merely the latest addition to the pattern, a voice re-entering the choir. In that moment of revelation, all fear dissolved into something stranger: recognition. Humanity, for the first time, sensed the enormity of belonging. The shells overhead thrummed softly, no longer cold barriers but membranes of inclusion. Through them came a final cascade of light, tracing spirals across oceans and continents. Wherever the light touched, it left symmetry. Mountain ridges straightened, fault lines healed, and the Earth's spin corrected by a fraction so small yet so deliberate it could not be coincidence. Then, silence again, but not the dreadful silence of absence. A silence of completion, like the pause after the last note of a symphony still hangs in the air. The lattice glowed faintly and steadied, fixed toward that distant hollow between galaxies. Somewhere in that void, something pulsed back 3 flashes, equally spaced. The 3 eyes, watching their work. Dr. Jana Voss, exhausted and trembling in the Geneva bunker, whispered what everyone already knew but dared not say aloud. They didn't come to conquer, they came to finish what they started. The resonance settled into the planet's bones. Clocks resumed their march. The seas cooled. The network dimmed, leaving only a faint aurora that shimmered at the edges of night. Humanity stood beneath a quiet sky, forever altered, listening to a silence that was no longer empty but filled with waiting. For above them, unseen but certain, the architects were listening too. The memory of light. When the flares faded, night returned, but not as it had before. The sky was no longer the vast void humanity had known. It was textured, rippling faintly like the surface of a dark ocean. The lattice remained invisible to ordinary sight, yet anyone who stared long enough felt its presence pressing back, a weight behind the stars that weren't there anymore. Light itself had changed. It no longer traveled freely. It lingered, curved, and slowed, as if the universe were remembering every photon before letting it go. They called it the memory of light. It began subtly, photographs taking longer to develop, telescopes capturing residual images even after shutters closed, after images that refused to fade from human retinas. Then came the mirrors, reflections delayed by a fraction of a second, lagging behind motion as though the world itself were caught buffering between frames. People grew uneasy. In some cities, the reflections whispered faint sounds not their own, soft harmonics that matched the oceanic pulse. Physicists struggled to describe what they observed. Light had always been the messenger of truth, revealing the shape of the universe. Now, it had become the archive of it. Every photon seemed to carry a memory of where it had been, a record of its own path through space and time. The architects had turned illumination into information. Reality was no longer just observed, it was remembered. At the old lunar relay, long abandoned but recently reactivated by autonomous systems, sensors detected traces of radiation forming spirals around the moon's shadowed rim. The patterns were too precise to be random interference. They matched the spectral signature of Atlas's last emission. The moon was now a reflector in the network, humming faintly as if it had joined the choir. The discovery drew attention from what remained of the world's scattered agencies. If the architects had turned the Earth into a transmitter, then the moon was now the first relay, a secondary node built from humanity's oldest companion. The resonance had expanded its reach, but light was more than just data now. It began to carry echoes. People noticed strange luminous apparitions on the edges of vision, ghostly silhouettes that flickered and dissolved before the eye could focus. Some claimed they saw ships, others faces. A few even reported seeing themselves, moments delayed, as if the future was shimmering a few seconds ahead. Scientists called it persistence interference, a phenomenon born of photons that refused to die. But those who had studied the cause knew better. Light had learned to remember, but it was also starting to speak. In a mountain village in Norway, where auroras now stretched across the sky every night, a group of children playing by a frozen lake noticed that the reflections of the northern lights on the ice were different from the sky above. They didn't mirror, they moved independently, forming shapes, circles, spirals, and eventually letters that no language could recognize but every heart seemed to understand. The villagers recorded the event and sent it to what remained of the planetary archive. AI systems parsed the light patterns and translated the symbols into numbers. The sequence repeated the same prime intervals first discovered in Atlas's pulse. The lights were communicating again through memory, not motion. Dr. Voss was the first to suggest the unthinkable. "They're not transmitting out anymore," she whispered to the dark, her voice raw from exhaustion. "They're transmitting in." The idea spread like wildfire through the remaining scientific networks. If the lattice had stabilized, perhaps the architects had inverted its function. Earth was no longer sending signals outward, it was receiving. The network had become a window, and through that window, something was about to look back. At the edges of the solar system, probes once thought lost began to awaken. Voyager 2, silent for decades, sent a single fragment of data, a sequence of pulses that matched the oceanic core's heartbeat. Pioneer's last disk, drifting endlessly through darkness, caught a faint resonance and vibrated until its circuits burned. Even the dead machines had joined the song. Then, for the first time since Atlas's arrival, the light in the night sky shifted not in brightness, but in quality. Every ray seemed sharper, as though focused from beyond. The black between stars deepened, and out of that darkness, a single beam emerged, a needle of cobalt light piercing through the void and striking the Earth's upper atmosphere. Unlike meteors, it made no entry flash, no shock wave. It simply arrived. Telescopes everywhere turned to follow it, and what they saw defied comprehension. The beam wasn't a straight line, it was an unfolding, a spiral unwrapping through dimensions unseen, its edges lined with figures of perfect geometry. As it struck the shell lattice, the entire planet resonated like a bell. The frequency that answered back was not the 27-hour cycle anymore. It was faster, more urgent, more alive. The light refracted across the world, and for one moment, everything that had ever been illuminated by sunlight appeared again. Ghost cities shimmered in midair. Extinct forests waved their spectral branches. The fossils buried deep within the earth glowed faintly like embers. Even the faces of the dead appeared for an instant, composed of pure radiance, smiling before dissolving back into the invisible. The Earth's memory, stored in photons, had come alive. Historians called it the recollection, but those who saw it firsthand called it something else entirely, a promise. The architects had not built a prison or a weapon. They had built a repository, a way for light itself to preserve the universe. Every planet, every star, every life would one day be recorded within this vast, silent network of memory. Still, a question lingered in every heart. If the architects were preserving everything, then why? What catastrophe required the universe to remember itself so completely? That night, beneath the glowing lattice, a fragment of a message arrived. It appeared across every screen, every reflection, every remaining frequency. A simple string of symbols, pulsing in intervals that formed one coherent phrase when translated into human language. When light forgets, darkness begins to build again. Then the lattice pulsed once more, and the beam retracted into the void. The stars flickered faintly at the edge of vision just for an instant before vanishing again, and humanity understood the weight of its place in this grand design. They were not the creators, nor the conquerors, but the caretakers of memory, chosen to guard the light before it forgot itself. The memory of light became not just a phenomenon, but a philosophy, a way to live in a world forever half glowing, half forgotten. And somewhere beyond the visible spectrum, the architects watched their work and waited for the next node to awaken, because the network was not complete. Not yet. The last broadcast. It began as a flicker, one that the instruments caught before the human eye did. The global monitoring network, reconstituted from scavenged satellites and grounded observatories, detected a new signal cutting through the static. It came from nowhere within the solar system, yet everywhere at once. It was not light this time, nor the soft hum of electromagnetic resonance. It was deeper, a tremor woven through the vacuum itself, like the cosmos exhaling. At first, the scientists assumed it was another calibration echo from the shells. But this tremor carried modulation. The amplitude rose and fell in ratios that were unmistakably artificial. Around the world, the last functioning observatories aligned their instruments, triangulating what could no longer be triangulated. The signal had no source. It seemed to radiate equally from every direction, as though the entire universe was speaking in one voice. And then, the sound arrived. It wasn't sound in the ordinary sense. There was no medium, no air to carry it. Yet people heard it, not through their ears, but somewhere deeper. The vibration entered the bones, the blood, the nerves. It resonated with something that had been waiting to respond since the first sunrise. The world fell still as every living creature turned toward the sky, not in fear, but in recognition. The last broadcast had begun. Across the electromagnetic spectrum, the same pattern unfolded. Short pulses followed by long ones, then a gap, then repetition. A sequence that scientists quickly identified as an encoded message. But unlike the previous transmissions, the mathematical order, the primes, the harmonic cycles, this one carried structure layered in ways that no algorithm could fully decode. It was language built not from symbols, but from relationships. Distance, rhythm, resonance. The message wasn't written, it was felt. In the depths of the Pacific, the oceanic cores responded first. They ignited like submerged suns, glowing through the water in spirals of blue light. The glow spread outward until entire coastlines shimmered like living glass. Instruments placed along the seabed recorded seismic vibrations, not of destruction but of coordination. The planet was moving in synchrony, humming back to the message with frequencies buried in its molten heart. In the stratosphere, the lattice responded too. The shells brightened, aligning their geometry in a precise choreography. Each layer pulsed once, then twice, then held a steady rhythm, amplifying the transmission. Earth was no longer a passive receiver, it was part of the chorus. Dr. Voss, hollow-eyed and sleepless in the Geneva bunker, listened to the data cascade across her monitors. Her colleagues were long gone, most having fled when the light memory event erased the distinction between illusion and reality. But she remained, not to understand, but to witness. She watched as the frequencies folded into one another until they reached an impossible harmony, a resonance that flattened the noise floor of the universe itself. And within that silence, the message resolved. It wasn't words, but something that every consciousness on Earth interpreted the same way, a feeling of vastness beyond comprehension, of design beyond cruelty, of endings that were not extinction, but transition. For the first time, humanity understood not through data or prophecy, but through shared cognition what the architects had been building. They had not come to warn, or conquer, or judge. They had come to connect. The broadcast was not a signal, it was an invitation. In that moment, all across the planet, light began to move differently. It no longer obeyed the old rules of reflection and refraction. Instead, it flowed like liquid thought, bending around objects, sliding across surfaces, merging into streams of pure luminescence that gathered into the sky. Cities emptied as people stood outside, faces tilted upward, watching rivers of light climb toward the heavens. For 27 minutes, the planet shone as one living entity. Every photon on Earth, every spark, every reflection, every flame rose into the lattice above. It didn't burn, it migrated. The oceans glowed, the mountains shimmered, the deserts glinted like polished stone. Even the dark side of the Earth illuminated itself, as if sunlight had remembered where it was needed. Then, the final modulation came. The lattice flared one last time, forming 3 radiant circles overlapping above the planet. The 3 eyes, the symbol that had haunted every equation, every myth, every dream. They pulsed once, then projected a pattern into the void, concentric rings expanding outward, faster than light could travel. A broadcast not of electromagnetic energy, but of space-time itself, a ripple written into the fabric of reality. And the message it carried was simple, clear, universal. Ready. For hours afterward, instruments continued to hum. Then, one by one, they fell silent. The shells dimmed, their surfaces fracturing into motes that drifted downward, dissolving into harmless ion dust before reaching the atmosphere. The oceanic cores cooled, leaving only deep, bioluminescent scars in the abyssal plains. The lattice above Earth faded, and for the first time in months, the stars returned newer, brighter, and subtly rearranged. The network was gone. The architects had moved on, but they had left something behind. Every digital record, every electromagnetic trace, every fragment of human broadcast history, the music, the speeches, the laughter, was missing from the archives, gone as though swept clean. Yet in the sky, faint glimmers spelled traces of old transmissions, Morse patterns, binary streaks, whispers of humanity's voice traveling endlessly outward. The architects had not erased them, they had taken them along. The last broadcast was not humanity's farewell, it was its ascension into the cosmic memory. Dr. Voss, standing on the observation deck of a silent world, looked up at the starlit sky that shimmered with subtle rhythm. The stars flickered in sequence, 3 at a time, as if echoing an ancient heartbeat. She smiled through tears and whispered to the dark, "They heard us." And the sky, impossibly, seemed to blink in answer. The silence after. The world did not end, it simply exhaled. When the 3 eyes faded and the lattice dissolved into starlight, there was no apocalypse, no sudden rupture in the sky, no blinding revelation that tore sanity apart. There was only a quiet, so deep it felt alive. The air seemed denser, heavier, as though reality itself had taken a long breath and was now holding it, waiting to see what humanity would do next. The silence after the broadcast was total. No hums, no tremors, no more flares from the seas. The oceans lay flat as obsidian, the skies an endless vault of restored constellations, yet those who looked long enough could sense that the stars had shifted not by much, just enough to suggest rearrangement, like the punctuation of a sentence rewritten by unseen hands. Astronomers confirmed what everyone already suspected. Entire constellations were subtly reoriented, not erased, not added, but aligned towards something. Governments were gone in all but name. Communication networks, once flooded with panic, had gone eerily silent. What remained of humanity gathered in pockets across the world, cities reborn into quiet sanctuaries, their people stripped of noise and urgency. The internet, once the pulse of civilization, existed only in fragments, an echo of the world that had screamed and feared and disbelieved. Now, they whispered. Those who had heard the broadcast still carried it in their bones. Some described it as an echo, others as a weight, an awareness of something vast humming beneath perception. They could sense the lattice still there, invisible, like the ghost of a structure that refused to leave memory. Scientists took to calling it the residual field, an electromagnetic calmness pervading the air, subtle but measurable. Plants grew faster in its presence. Water behaved differently, forming symmetrical ice patterns even at non-freezing temperatures. The Earth had changed. But it was not destruction, it was calibration. Dr. Voss lived long enough to see the first signs of what the architects had truly left behind. Months after the lattice faded, her instruments rebuilt from scavenged tech, and powered by the remnants of the oceanic core systems, picked up faint signatures deep beneath the Earth's crust. It wasn't seismic nor magnetic. It was architectural, layered geometries, precise beyond geological randomness, embedded miles below the mantle. Something had been left behind. Not a machine, not a base, but a pattern, structures folded into atomic alignments, altering how minerals crystallized, how heat transferred, how energy moved. The entire planet had become a memory lattice in miniature, a smaller reflection of the vast network that once spanned the sky. The architects had turned Earth into an archive of itself. When the realization reached the surviving scientific community, they called it the Great Preservation. Earth was no longer just a home, it was a vessel. Every life, every moment, every sound that had ever existed now resonated faintly within the quantum geometry of the planet. Time was stored like sediment, layer upon layer of memory encoded into the rocks, the air, the oceans. But what was it preserving against? That question haunted them. The architects had not spoken of apocalypse nor salvation. Their final word, ready, was not an ending but a threshold. Ready for what? For whom? Dr. Voss spent her final years searching for that answer, translating the residual harmonics of the lattice into what she called the long equation. It described not the physics of light or space, but continuity, how existence could persist through cycles of cosmic decay, rebirth, and memory. Her final entry in the Geneva logs read, "They build when civilizations near silence. They come not to warn but to weave. Every node that forgets is reconnected, every world reborn into memory." Perhaps we are not the first to reach this point, perhaps none of us ever were. Her death went unnoticed by most, but a few who remained by her side claimed that, in her last moments, her eyes reflected the same blue hue that had once lit the oceans. Years passed. The planet grew quieter still. With no signals leaving Earth and none arriving, humanity was left with itself, its art, its stories, its newfound awareness that it was part of something immeasurable. Cities became observatories, and silence became worship. People no longer looked up to ask if someone was out there, they looked up to remember that someone had been. Children born after the broadcast learned of Atlas as both myth and history. They called it the bright messenger, the one who taught light to remember. Its story was carved into crystalline libraries, powered by the residual harmonics of the lattice structures that hummed softly, as if still alive. And once every 27 years, without fail, a faint glow returned to the horizon. No brighter than dawn's first light, no louder than the heartbeat of the world. It lasted only a moment, yet every sensor on Earth detected the same harmonic spike, the signature frequency of the architect's network. It was as if the stars themselves were checking in, whispering across infinity. Still here, still remembering, humanity would answer in the only way it knew. It built great transmitters not to send messages outward, but inward. Sound turned into light. Light turned into memory. Every song, every voice, every dream was etched into the lattice of the Earth, given back to the network that had once lifted them into the sky. Over centuries, this practice became faith, not religion, but remembrance, a covenant between light and life. And though no architect ever returned, their absence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like trust, for in the silence after the storm of revelation, humanity had finally learned the one truth hidden behind all the whispers, the fear and the wonder. The universe had never been empty. It had always been listening. And now, so were they.